Story already starts out that very chaotic way, with a guy up from a nightmare, just to realize that his reality wasn't much better. The city in the dream, it was infested with bizarre creatures, but the boy called Luchin discovers that in the real world, a terror era outbreak. Since he was in the classroom, he wakes up with the teacher giving that classic sermon, because the kid was sleeping on the hard face, and the whole gang starts to laugh. And the teacher, to make it worse, warns that they are missing only 200 days to the end of the exam, while apparently, Luxem only had the talent to take a nap. And the teacher does not relieve on his side, not saying that with this sloth, not even for luxury Masson sir, questioning if he was planning, spend your whole life carrying bricks, and the other students already full of malice think the teacher should leave the Luchin's ink alone. And seeing that it really was a lost case, the teacher ends up releasing the class. At this time, a kind of weird friend of the protagonist, called Lo King Main, arrives calling him Zenzi, and asks if he had those horrible nightmares. Luxem ends up explaining that the place of the dream, it was very depressing and full of monsters, and that in this joke made his mental state and life status drop, both that he needed until he took a medicine after that, and what in me with all the sincerity in the world, tell him to rest a little. Remembering that luxury status was much worse than his, and how are normal humans without talents, but forget this hero life and accept mediocrity. The friend then ends up inviting the Luchin to go to the house, play a little, promising to pay for drinks. But the Luchin ends up refusing, since he needed to go home and enjoy his bad mood. That ends up insisting on me a little, but soon gives up when other colleagues call him to play. So the two end up saying goodbye, and then you press the truth. Luxem reincarnated in this world, and he is outraged that even changing universes still had to worry about school exams. While he was walking, he ended up looking at the screens in the buildings, passing news, realizes that the ancient world was not so different from this. But suddenly, a girl, Murama-san, passes carrying several boxes, and sends the Luxem or get out of the way right now. Is that this kid was getting in her way, and Luchin is very surprised, wanting to know what that girl was taking, and that I wanted to have her strength. But the scene ends up cutting to his house, where a gentleman was getting a massage from his wife. And he asks affectionately, but she said he was very fresh and let him be very quiet. And here you can already find out who's boss. At home, Luxury comes right on time, and his mother warns him that he is going to make dinner at his father did. Luxem suggests, buy a circulation device, blood to improve energy. Old man's vital, but the father ends replying that it was his age thing, but surprises everyone by taking the gift out of their pocket, and it was an expensive regeneration powder that cost the price of a car. The wife was in shock, and starts slapping your husband, saying he was amazing. But she hits so hard, that looked like who wanted to kill the old man for spending so much money. So the mother seizes the moment, and brings a pork left over from war, to celebrate their father's effort, making it clear that the family's financial situation, it was too tight. But already in the middle of dinner, parents ask about Deluxe life status, wanting to know if he got to 0 at 85 already, that his sister was a prodigy, and it was almost 0.9. The boy then ends up getting very unfunny with appearance and flees to the room to train. Begins to practice a body reconstruction technique, a mix of yoga and martial arts, made to help beginners. And the context was that the world changed 300 years ago, when rifts opened in heaven and earth, bringing monsters that messed up completely that world. To survive, humanity ended up unlocking a genetic trap, and the era of martial arts began. Even so, humans were still at a disadvantage, and died in droves, training just to make sure the species doesn't go extinct by the monsters. Luxem ends its exercise series, but realizes you've lost status because of the nightmares. Feeling the weight of your father's sacrifice, who bought a medicine, he decided to push the bar and train a lot more. And the result of it, he got very dizzy, and ended up blacking out, up right on the of your nightmares. And he tries to wake up, but unfortunately he can't, since a zombie ends up running into him and pushing him, and Luciana, who has a combat status, ridiculous from 0.7, manages to divert by pure luck. I do not despair. He ends up kicking the zombie and getting up quickly, crushing the creature's head with a stone. But the joy was short-lived. A blue energy ended up coming out of the zombie, entering directly into Luchin's body, and suddenly, he gets to see lots of memories of the monster when he was still human, dreaming of joining the army and training until the time the base was attacked. Shin gets very confused, without understanding, because he was watching the movie of life. Pat deceased. But at that moment another zombie ends up attacking, but something strange happens. That energy runs through Luchin's body, and he takes down a monster very easily. He goes back to normal, frightened by his own strength, and he realizes that energy was integrating into your body. Then his plug falls. He didn't just gain the zombie memories, but also absorbed the fighting strength that creature had. And Luchin ends up getting really surprised with that sudden experience of life. And he sighs, hoping that wasn't just a dream. But it really all looked very realistic. He still saw the energy imbued in the creature and had wide eyes. The memory of the base 1359 appeared in his mind, place that appeared in the zombie memories, and he decided he needed to find that place, since there must be something very important there. And its logic was quite simple. He needed to kill more zombies in the dream, to keep getting stronger and stronger in real life, since their memories were very useful. Suddenly, Lukton ends up feeling something strange and wakes up sweating very cold. And his sister, Luke was puzzling the door, warning that it was time to eat. He opens the door to say hey, but the girl treats him like shit. She is a pretty girl, but acts like a seer. Making sure your brother was a bomb, that was only good for sleeping. Lukton admits he fell asleep a little by accident. Only his sister ends up getting very surprised upon noticing that he was suddenly muscular, but ends up turning his back and asks him to eat soon. Continues about how he got a physicist so quickly. Lukton remembers that they were very close in childhood, but all that changed when she received the first results of the school and revealed that it was much stronger than him, and how she was a prodigy, destined for a prestigious university. He ended up becoming the brother, believe in her vision. But alone, he ends up taking off his shirt, and is very surprised by his new muscles. He doesn't feel a little lazy. On the contrary, was full of energy, and with all the zombie combat memories fresh in memory, he realizes he can replicate the techniques, and begin to believe that he really brought the strength of the dream to reality. And it even looked like a fairy tale, getting stronger just sleeping. And that's why you named this work of war. Of the Bahian nor easy for cancel it, I go to each one of your houses. But after that, he goes to the dinner table with the family, and he was made thinking mother's food was the best thing in the world. He orders another bowl, and realizes the whole family was looking at him, very scared. Even he doesn't understand why he's so hungry, but the father always protective. I didn't want to let my son feel like it. Father asks wife to make more rice, thinking that Luxembourg was in that phase of growth from puberty, and that's exactly why he was eating like it. He pets the boy on the shoulder friendly, and warns that it will bring tonics, nutritious ingredients the next day. Only at this moment, Pony tries to put its brother down again. But her dad ends up cutting her cheap one, saying it was wrong to belittle Luchin, since he still believed in his son's potential. Luchin thinks that if his status went up in the dream, he needed to test this on a dojo. So the scene cuts for him in front of a guy's establishment called Nihonshuan, a specialist in boxing and city prominence. The owner was a level 4 martial artist. What in this world meant basically being a superhuman. Liu Chen sees that the school was attended only by people very rich, but decides to ignore it and focus on your goal. He enters and the receptionist asks if he wants to sign up in classes, but he warns that he just wants to do health and attack power assessment. And the woman already understands at the same time that he was very poor, but shows the way to him. Lukton puts his hand on the measuring device, and the result shows a health status of 0.xax, and he is very happy, without believing in it, because he was almost replacing his sister, who is a genius, and if it continues like this, the martial arts path was completely guaranteed. Only now it was time for him to test his brute strength. He goes to the other machine, channels the zombie technical experience, and lets go of the arm. And the result was 113 points of combat power. Luchin ended up in shock, thinking the machine had broken, because this number made him a true martial artist. He gets really excited, thinking if he only slept an hour, and has already won it all. Imagine if he slept 10 hours. But the scene ends up changing to him in bed, with her very wide eyes, because he was very angry, because he just couldn't sleep. And he screams in frustration, but it was still 9 in the night, and decided to get tired to sleep came. He started exercising, and in the midst of your silence, he ends up making a very complex movement, and gets scared because he tried to do that since I was a child. And he realizes it was the muscle memory of the technique, zombie edging his body. And he starts testing other blows, and note that you now know more than 200 attacks and breathing techniques. Luchin finds it all funny, and sees that it was evolving in a very insane way. And suddenly, a bizarre famine ends up hitting him, strong enough to leave him on the floor, and he understands that his body was unable to produce enough energy to sustain this increase in power, and needed nutrients. The problem is that the family salary was so low, and paying for these supplements won't be easy at all. Luchin knew he couldn't let his evolution stall for lack of resources. He needed money urgently, and then he remembers that the school was going to give a certificate to students, copies, accompanied by a prize money of more than $10,000. And the plan was already made to put your hand on that money. He would have to show he wasn't there for fun. So the scene ends up cutting to the sports area, straight into the locker room, and that in me everything was relieved because the teacher didn't spend the whole class speaking of proof, but the ends. When he ends up his eye Nile Sheen. And the kid was totally cracked. Marbled wire. The friend was soon wanting to know where the Luchin got all that yellow juice. Even because it hadn't even been 10 days since the guys had seen each other and fought in the greatest calm. Says he's just been practicing a little crazy fake in it. Is hiding, but his hair had grown too, and was in need of a cut. And that in me, with your mind always focused on the irrelevant, thought the friend had only trained for combat class that day. In a desperate attempt to try impress the girls, but Luke and me swore I didn't care about women. That his head was centered. Although deep down he thought that was a chance, gold for him to get popular. But in the martial arts hall, the combat teacher groaned. I wanted the class to consolidate the basics, and that in me had heard rumors that the teacher was level 2 and had that scar on his arm, because he had already gone out in the hand with monsters. However, the little fight looked at what it does. For him the level 2 attacks, it was child's play, close to what he absorbed into the dream world with zombies, and the teacher ended up explaining the important points, and ended up calling a student to serve as bag of blows in the demo. And it was Ian Wei-Fei. The guy was that classic blonde, handsome who made girls drool at the same time, and who and me hated that scene, finding it ridiculous how the guy stole all the attention just for being rich and handsome. Is a Wei-Fei gives a kick, and the teacher ends up blocking. Luchin just watched that, thinking your level was far beyond that demo, and that he would fight for what he wanted. Yo professor ends up praising the student's sharp movements, but says his balance was bad, and that I would call other students to help translate this. And the Yan Fei was very to the soul, and thought the teacher was weaker, that the coach, particular of his family, and that your future would be much brighter. The teacher then asks, who wanted to fight the blonde? And the captain ends up reigning in that place, and the poor guy turns his face, pretending they weren't even talking to them. That in me ends up napping to luxury, that they had no chance against him, who would only be publicly ashamed if they tried to. And the teacher disappointed in this bunch of fearful, and said he couldn't teach people without courage, and that only those who enjoyed life status and martial arts will shine. And he thought no one there was the height of Ian Wei-Fei until he ends up crossing his eyes with luxury, and the master ends up being very impressed, because you saw a very different corpse in that boy, and it was the look of someone who has seen many real fights. And so he ends up quickly choosing the protagonist, and that in me there was almost a stretch in the same time trying to convince the friend not to go, not to sink their reputation once and for all, but the Lucci sent his friend to relax, warning that it has prepared a lot for that day. The fight would be friendly with a 10-minute limit. The two get into position. Yo professor, Lucian's absurd is strange, in front of the strongest student in the classroom, and asks what his life status was, and Lucian ends up lying in the face, saying it was 0.8. What the teacher thinks is very low, but it gives a sign of beginning. Ian Wei-Fei ends up starting with your tease. Very cheap. Sending the luxury to protect his head. The funny and ironic protagonist thanks for his warning. And the blonde ends up moving with absurd speed. And the hand ends up getting very close to the luxury face, and in effect already smiles, believer who had won that battle, and that the impact would be brutal, and the whole gang was really scared at that moment. But his smile fades at the same time. Luchin was no longer there. He had ducked and in a clean motion landed a punch with everything in his face, and the boy ends up bouncing on the floor with so much violence, and will end up on the feet of the other students. The teacher at that moment was in total shock. Luxem ended that battle with a single punch, and nobody understood absolutely nothing. And the Moonfei was with the ended face on the floor, and the teacher coming out of the trance ends up screaming through a cloud, and the blonde who was finding himself the king, he just ended up getting off a stretcher. Luciano ends up apologizing to the teacher, saying he didn't control his strength very well, and the teacher tries to maintain the posture and says they were learning, and it was nothing serious, but warns that they needed to have a little talk. They're at the office, and Luxem ends up warning his friend that he was already back. Bottle is. I was hearing a little noise from the crowd, who couldn't believe what they were seeing. So at that moment the scene changes to teacher's office. Lux noticed that guy grew bonsai. The teacher starts a philosophical chat that everyone has bodies and everyone has secrets, making it very clear that he knew that punch, it didn't come from someone with 0 status. Point E. The luxury tries to dodge, saying that was the result of your last measurement, and the teacher goes straight to the point with him. He wanted to know if the luxury was taking some medicine or drug to increase strength, because it was strictly against the rules. Luxury ended up getting surprised, and swore standing together to the teacher that he never used anything illicit, and the Zonzingo wanted to get the real proof of it, deciding to measure his life extract right there. For if it were the effect of the medicine, the number would swing, and the prota ended up putting his hand on the device, and the result was solid, 1.5. And the teacher ended up being completely in shock, because for a year-old boy, That was already a level of legitimate martial artist. The kid, simply, would be considered a genius of the entire city. Excited, Luxem went to test the fighting strength and punched the device. The result turned out to be chaos, since he broke the machine, and broke it, destroyed the good, leaves the teacher's pet that was next door. And the teacher at that moment looked at the plant curls with an absurd desire to cry, while realizing that the student was at a level well above one. Luchin sat in the chair scared of the damage, as the teacher tried to pull himself together to ask when that was his last measurement. Luchin revealed that it had been just 15 days ago, and the teacher almost fell back, because this evolution was impossible, unless the boy was the heir to a fortune, or had a particular great master. And Luchin denied it all and said the method was a secret. The teacher ended up being impressed, and began to remember army times, when he realized that ordinary humans were useless against monsters, and that only true aberrations of forces made difference, and he decided at the same time, wanted to speak with the administration to place Luchin in the best possible classes with the best teachers. Luciano thanked the intention, but he said he didn't need all that, since his method of learning was sleep, though I couldn't tell them the other part. The teacher insisted, but the student made a counter-proposal. He wanted the martial arts scholarship and mostly more free time during school hours. The teacher agreed with this, realizing the boy's lack of resources, and offered 30,000 an hour. And we didn't ask. The teacher ended up handing over an art cart, black martials, with a limit of at least 100,000, saying he could pay when he could. Men on Google saw there the chance to regain the honor of the school, and planned to use the Luchin as a secret weapon to scare the other institutions at the end of the exam, and urgently needed warned superiors that finally had someone capable of going to that special place. Luchin came out of there, and the scene ended up changing to a store, showing a refined supplement that was a fortune. A mother bought her daughter, and the dislocation watched, knowing your parents could never afford it. And he reflected on how difficult it was for a poor man become a great martial artist without resources, and that, like your sister, even though I'm a prodigy, had potential limited by lack of money. And he realized that before, he lived like a fish in it, afraid to leave the comfort zone. But now he had completely broken this barrier, and he mentally promised his sister and parents that would change the fate of their family, and would continue to seek strength. Then the scene ends up going back to the dream, with him exchanging punches with Zombie. This time the monster knew how to fight, and it looked like he had been a martial artist in past life. Luchin brought down the creature, and strange not to find more monsters near the base. 1359. But suddenly an order appeared, and he finally ended up finding such a base, and was impressed by the size of the wall. Looked more like a heavily fortified city. He climbed up and ended up finding a huge hole in the structure. Inside, between central command buildings, he saw something very different, and it was a zombie just holding a sword. And as soon as he approached, the dead-eyed creature immediately woke up. Sheen ended up getting a gigantic scare. He ended up feeling a strange presence, and received a shock wave, and felt an amazing aura coming towards the zombie. That ended up intimidating him completely. At the same time, and without thinking twice, he found it much more prudent. Don't even go near that place. He decided to look around, and found some lower-level zombies. And so he ended up jumping, sharing one of them very easily, and entering a nearby location. He realized there were no zombies there. Looked like a normal apartment, no signs of break-in, and it ended up making him curious and confused, wondering if people in there became zombies because of that scary black mist. And curiosity spoke louder when he saw a device. He played to see if it worked, and ended up the device by voice command. The system warned that it was restarting, and suddenly a hologram of a girl appeared. She informed that it was the technology of Law Celestial. Luciano ended up getting scared, not only because of the image appearing in front of him, but because that technology, unknown, spoke the same language as him. And he started to think that machine, it actually had real-time translation. And the girl ends explaining that it was an artificial intelligence with a generation brain, created to assist and manage the base network. Military. 1359. Shin was very impressed with the breakthrough by technology and asked for the latest news, and then tried to connect to Sky. But the connection failed miserably. Sky. She connected it to the military base's own database. Luxembourg was simply bombarded with news, and ended up discovering, which was in the year 11,024, and he saw records of a class 10 martial artist, and fell almost backwards, believing to be in a parallel world, where martial progress was unable. But his joy ended up being short-lived, since he saw the pictures from the sky cracking, monsters appearing, and technology evolving. Absurdly, nor the martial artist class 10, not even the giant walls bothered. The monsters and the black mist. They just destroyed everything. Luxembourg saw that civilization had given up and tried to escape to another planet. But they were simply annihilated in the process. In that world there was no happy ending, and he recognized bitterly that humans are unable to prevent extinction, even with all the progress they had made. He then asked me to investigate the history of the world, and when he delivered the data, he just ended up getting a scare. He wasn't seeing the parallel world, but the story of his own world being destroyed after 10,000 years. And still with the tip of hope of being a coincidence, he asked me to retrieve his personal information. But he managed to find his data. Luxem lived to be 28 years old as a common citizen, which was quite disappointing. He asked about his sister, but the inn denied access, since he was a guest, and her sister was a martial artist. To create an account with privileges, he needed to provide a sample of your blood. But he didn't know how to do that on the device, and Ya's solution just went for a bite. Hot on his finger. What ended up leaving our protag completely ashamed. With the drop of blood, the analysis started and suddenly, then ended up completely changing her posture. Since the revolution plan, it was simply activated out of nowhere, and I thought I wasn't understanding anything, until he saw that the information about him had changed completely, including just the photo. The future had been changed, and now he was listed as the 23rd, placed in the city of Bear, and he had entered the University of Martial Arts. And the new records said that 3 years later, he entered the military, served at Tiananmen base, and died on Ur at 37 years old. And a sad detail that he focused a lot is that he just died single. And he went so far as to be first lieutenant, but without great glories or contributions. Lucien was very frustrated, because even getting stronger, he was not considered a genius, and he thought there must be some mistake, but decided to ignore it completely. He decided he needed to continue cultivating and using that dreamland to change your real future. Since being 20th, third place wasn't enough for him. Since he wanted to be one of the best of dreams, and wanted everyone to know who he was. The goal now was to get strong, enough to prevent the extinction of the human race, making your savior and leader in the revolution. So the scene ends up moving to the luxury house. He ends up getting his uniform, and your mother ended up strange, asking if today he didn't have class, and he invented that the teacher released him to study at home. But the mother didn't understand very well, because I had never heard of it, but ended up accepting. But after eating, he warned that he was going to his room to study. In Quantizo, his sister, who Phil's, watched the older brother with a lot of distrust, realizing that he had changed a lot in a short time. That way, he ends up going into the room and his phone rings. Zonzengo was calling, warning that the scholarship had arrived, and he too, strange the Luxembourg fact, is not going to school. Luxembourg ends up responding quickly, saying I was out of time, and that he would then contact and turn off. Without much talk, his head at that moment, I was focused on just one thing. Hit stronger and surprise everyone. Since there was no shortcut to climb to the top, just demonstrate power, and that's the only way I can change the future. Right after, he ended up returning to Dreamland, and sends artificial intelligence, taste everything that existed about martial arts. Ethics, dose, tips all the same. The problem is that we had too much, so he asks to filter better, and it was supposed to do better for worse, focusing only on first-class martial artists. When the result appears, Lucien almost pyres for good. The best methods of the last 10,000 years was right in front of him, of the stellar body created by one Ri. Ian Rise's natural breathing technique, and the contemplation of Duan Wang crystals. All of this was first-rate, since the creators were level 9. While in his world the strongest barely made it to level 9. So it was a very absurd thing. We're just introductory chapters, but I could already see an insane advantage. And everyone was part of the Spark project. That looks like until the creators knew that someone in the future would need that. And that someone in quotes was Lucien himself. To transform the human body into a mini-universe. Distant mind, firm spirit, how refined. Your body was strengthened, and each cell became a cloud of power. But also defense and strength reached the extreme. So he decides to test the natural breathing technique. And the first form was the breath of fire. And this is how it starts. He feels like he is fling, blowing inside your body, and even gives a scare. Then it ends up switching to crystal contemplation, focused on the purification of the mind, and strengthening the will. Was that spiritual power? Sitting on the floor, he tries again, and ends up seeing his own spirit world, and he knew that the spiritual will, it was essential for a martial artist to evolve quickly. But I had no idea what he was doing. Wings inside, since everything was new, and it looked like it was going to take a long time. But suddenly he ends up exhausted, dead tired and feeling a stench. Absurd. His sweat was filthy. and he couldn't guess that it had come from the dream world too. So he will directly shower her, and techniques were spreading through his body and eliminating impurities. The training progress was going to be ridiculously fast. When the bag was in hand, he could make medicine and stay even stronger. And in his head, sure, he would mess with the industry, world pharmaceuticals. So the scene ends up changing to the dance. And Zengo delivered the scholarship to Luchin and asks him to warn. When Aya went back to school, Luchin ends up apologizing, thinking it gave an absurd headache. But the teacher just wanted him to show up at school, at least once a week. But when the dime leaves the office, Zengo realizes that in just 2 days, I couldn't understand that boy anymore. Even because it looked like he had evolved a lot in these last 2 days. Onrua Luxem began to plan, since now he had money and needed to resolve his key shortage right away. With medical prescriptions of the future, could create absurdly efficient supplements. According to artificial intelligence, the best for him, it was the breeding ground for muscle and blood, and a bone nutrient length. The problem with all this was money, so he tries to rent pharmacy facilities. He goes to a lab, but the person in charge thinks he was playing with his face. Says that lab was the most valuable in the pharmacy. Luxembourg would not have access to any secret recipe, and closed the door right in his face, calling him a tramp kid. Even so, Luxembourg had already appeared in 7 stores, and the ingredients were bought. The card had 80,000, and he distrusts that Grown had put the money out of his own pocket. No laboratory for rent. The way out was to buy basic equipment and improvise. Until he ends up finding a pharmacy in one place, very suspicious, and decides to enter, and the pharmacist was playing with his cell phone. And the crazy guy was too rude. He then sent the Luchin to get whatever he wanted, and pay, and put your foot in there as soon as possible. He wasn't even supposed to think about painting, because there were cameras everywhere. And this crazy guy was still drooling, seeing a girl on his cell phone, but Luchin asks for patience and crushes the cell phone, as if it were paper. The guy ends up freaking out, but the Luchin's his aura, and a murderous intention. Very heavy and overwhelming, and the pharmacist crashes at the same time, all shit asking what he wanted. And the luxury ends up asking directly if there was a laboratory there, pharmaceutical, but the guy ends up looking strange and says he was selling there, remise and ready, but Luxem explains that he wanted to make a certain agreement. In the end the deal goes 500 per hour, 3 maximum hours, and Luxem ends up accepting this without thinking, and the game finally begins. I didn't even want to hear the rest, and already warned that he would pay in advance, enter directly into the laboratory. And his first time there, everything was kind of tense, but he was very focused. He prepared the ingredients carefully, ripped off the green scales of the mutant lizard, and who made the moonstone, and suffered too much to cut a branch too hard. But in the end it all worked out. The muscle and blood enrichment soup was finally ready. On the first attempt he had already managed what was really fun, and he was all happy with this progress. But real success was only possible when drinking, and so he ended up proving, and since it had no taste, he already started to think he had failed, mentally calling each other. Until suddenly, that stretch started to kick in all at once. Luchin ended up falling to the ground, feeling your body would explode from the inside out. The supplement was too strong, and replenished everything things that were missing from him for a long time, and still without side effect. All perfect. The knowledge accumulated over 10,000 years of martial arts, doing real effect. Only at that exact time they started slamming the door. He missed, and saying the time was not over yet, and he didn't want to be bothered. Only the pharmacist was in a panic, sending he run as fast as possible, since he couldn't explain in time, and said to go out the back, because the boss had returned. And she was a very elegant woman, and the pharmacist was all dull, trying to talk to her. Her name was Ri, and she had said she was going to the neighboring town, but came back too fast. And the pharmacist was all that woman, and thought she was beautiful in any situation, even very angry. In his head only he could protect her, and still dreamed of a happy ending, only then ended up yelling at him, and that guy's name was Muffy. And she wanted to know if he had taken someone in hiding for the alchemy laboratory, since she saw dirty clothes there, but the guy thought she was beautiful even fighting, but swore he had done absolutely nothing. Lying in the hard face, Muffy tried to explain himself, but to her he was nothing more than an idiot, and she was very angry, thinking about the work I was going to do, clean that and disinfect everything. The table was very filthy, until the laser activator and controller had been used, and that's when she ended up seeing a lizard, green scale mutant. And she had never seen such a method in her life. On time, this to anyone trying to develop the medicine itself. But for that I needed knowledge. Very absurd pharmaceutical. Too much money, and too many experiments. Someone without a lab betting on it was a crazy thing. And with that the girl ended up getting very pregnant. until they realized that not only did they use the lab, how they broke things. So she decided that she would analyze that situation. By smell and appearance identify the ingredients. But I've never seen that combination before. Too much love she put just a drop in her mouth. And her eyes ended up squinting at the same time, so the scene ends up changing to Mephi, already with those bags ready. He was outraged, throwing all the blame on the Luchin to be prevented, thinking he had missed any chance. With the Re forever. And in his mind, he just wanted to see her at least one more time. And when he looked back, she was there calling for him, and at that moment he got very confused, without understanding absolutely nothing. Only Re sent him to stop right now, and he ended up getting excited, with eyes full of tears and arms open, saying his place was right next to her. Only he laughed at her for her clothes, and began to shake him like a doll, wanting to know who had used their lab. Since she wanted to see that person. Immediately, in bad faith, I understood absolutely nothing. And she repeated without any patience, and said that if he spoke who he was, would have his job back and salary doubled. At the same time, he ended up telling that he had a contact with the person. And she quickly fell, his cell phone in an absurd hustle. And the medicine she had tasted was at least 10 times better. That strengthening tonics, average $100,000, and it still improved the skin and had other effects, a really world-class tonic. And ended up getting euphoric, as it could be her family's chance. So the scene ends up changing to Luchin, training the stellar body technique. An absurd skill, capable of awakening the potential of the human body. Something beyond the normal understanding of that time. And he believed that so I could give a birth to a real star. Inside your own body, and the natural breathing technique helped too much. Without her the result would be trash. His vitality had increased a lot. And he had already done 12 servings of that medicine, and with the current physique, 2 a day was enough. But he needed to figure it out. In 6 days his cell phone ended up ringing, and Luchin answered it, and it was laughing, apologizing for and presenting himself as in charge of the medical room, Shan, and said who had seen the method he left behind, and made it clear that that tonic, it could change their time a lot. Ended up offering a collaboration, and Luxury ended up accepting quickly, making an appointment for a week later. Only then he ended up in despair, because she wanted to find him right away. Only Luchin just ended up turning it off right in the face, and quickly ended up achieving in faith again. Without any delicacy, making it very clear that he was supposed to find responsible for that tonic, and the faster the better. And she gave 6 days as a limit, and still threw a bait. He would earn $10,000 for each day saved. The son was very happy, almost jumping, and just asked her not to go back on her word. Still thought she got it all wrong. Because the guy who used the lab didn't even have, not even 20 years, and it just seemed like some kind of poison. And when he said this, then he ended up crashing at the same time and was in real shock. Only the scene ends up changing to the Luchin in Dreamland, beating down a zombie. But it wasn't anyone. There was a huge zombie holding something. And Luchin at the same time felt that target was right. And the animal ended up crushing what he had in his hand and left for the top. Luchin was at level 1 still, and wanted to see if I could handle an artist. Level 4 martial. The zombie ended up punching and he managed to block it. But the attack was very brutal. And in strength was at least twice as great as his. And I really couldn't get him to lock right. That attack. The zombie keeps attacking, and Luchin has dodged, fitting the kick. Straight that ended up pushing that monster, and taking advantage of this madness. He managed to finish and kill that huge zombie. Taking your memories, he saw that guy alive. Killed monsters to death on the front line, protecting the city. And he realized he was defeating people who died, defending humanity, and the zombie had rating 5 when he was still alive, and so those punches were completely absurd. And the Luchin had only managed to win that battle because that zombie didn't think, and still without an arm, fighting just by instinct, and already did, 1 week that he had learned those techniques in Dreamland. And integrated zombie fist techniques, with the art of body refining, stellar, but also with the natural breathing technique. His power would surely explode. And 100 times stronger thing. Only there wasn't much time to celebrate, since other zombies have appeared. Luchin tested a new integrated attack that he called a Star Impact, but with a sharp cut. He was already back in the dojo, talking to the receptionist for rent, an evaluation machine, but she ended up weirding. He have come back so quickly, as soon as the exams were coming. And status didn't change out of nowhere. Luchin ended up explaining that maybe he had improved, at least a little bit. Usually people only came back after months. But she freed up the available room. He checked the vitality. And she was just 15.6. It was just insane and had increased too much. Already passed in the easy, Rain 2 martial artist standard. And it made sense, since he took advanced tonics and trained supreme techniques, but after that he ended up testing combat power, and a hard punch gave 3,137. More than double required. There he concluded that if a skill affected combat power, the supreme value should be even greater. So he forgot and ended up launching a stellar impact. The scene ends up changing suddenly and the employee asks if he had already finished, thinking he was very happy. Luch ended up confirming by saying yes, I was very happy, and she wished good luck on the exam and he left. And she even thought our main character was very cute. Soon after, a girl ended up coming in with a guy, and the girl's name was Ni Xuan, and was the master's daughter from Hong Xuan of martial arts. I wanted to know what the receptionist was talking about, Nisha, before I brought the boy to the medicine bath, and asked if Luchin was anyone of interest to her. The receptionist ended up saying no, and all I thought was that boy was really cute. And the guy ended up being envious, and tried to disguise it, saying that what mattered in that world was the proficiency in martial arts, and that Luchin just looked like some kid. Nishuan released that poor thing is going to school, and Rich trained real martial arts. And the guy already had high vitality. Even before starting to cultivate, after he started practicing various techniques, the difference between him and others only grew a lot. Arrogance came along, but Nishuan punched him in the head. For him to stop being a sucker, remembering that he had an obligation to be strong, with so many resources available to him. And so he ended up a lot with this blow. He then ends up telling his senior sister, who wanted to see the results of Luchin's review, since he seemed to be a little older than him. That would be a great way to compare his levels. Nishuan ended up giving in, but warned him not to brag, if Luchin was just an ordinary guy. But when the receptionist showed the results, Nishuan was completely in shock. Since that seemed to be impossible, the boy then scared, said that machine could only be broken. But the receptionist replied that she had no way, since the maintenance had been done the day before. Nishuan ended up being completely in shock, since the results were real. She then asked the receptionist, Ling call. Try to get the address, or number of Luxembourg. But that boy was not a member of the dojo. Even so, Ling promised to do everything possible to find that boy. Then the scene ends up changing again, with Luchin leaving by taxi, when the taxi driver started a very strange chat to his side, wanting to present his daughter to him. But Luchin ended up making up a story so as not to look crazy, because I had gone there just to do artist test. Classification 2 Martial. When I was about to enter, a crazy guy ran out and almost ran him over. The subject was suffering, with the power leaking from his body. The Martial Arts Association machines were all customized, and they were much more accurate than ordinary ones. The result could be even smaller, but Luchin thought it was great, because that way he would know the value, accurate, of your own abilities. He went to a blonde receptionist and asked information to take the martial artist certification test. He took a form and was advised that after him, fill that, he would have to go to the number room 5203. When he got there, he ran into a gigantic queue. And he already got kind of mad, didn't have much time, and didn't know what to do in that situation. While waiting, heard two guys commenting on a girl, saying she was very beautiful, and it seemed to be very strong. Lucy noticed that most there was about 25 years old, so he was much younger than everyone else. But out of nowhere there appeared a gigantic guy breaking through the queue. A guy was all excited with the form in his hand, thinking that was the beginning of his journey. When the big guy just walked by pushing all over, world doing, the kid gets a full landscape face. But the crowd got tense, because that crazy guy looked like a walking wall. Even so, some didn't like it, and started to complain, saying he couldn't pass in front of everyone like this. But the big guy ignored General, and went straight to the employee, and delivered the form. The weather was already weird, but when the employee saw the paper, changed completely on time, and let him go first. And the reason was very simple, the guy would do rating 3 martial artist review. And everyone at the same time ended up in shock. And in the whole city of Bahia, there were only 10 martial artists at that level. And in this world, strength commanded everything. So whoever was stronger had privileges even. And the name of that monster was Chaojin Feng. He took the vitality test and showed 107.2. And the whole room ended up in silence. At the same time, then came the combat power test, and the impact made the room structure shake. And the result, it was simply 10,831. The employee ended up congratulating him, warning that now, he would receive 30,000 a month and a supplement of cultivation and the 3-star martial artist certificate. Their Jean Feng didn't even realize he had hurt several people with its impact, and everyone at that moment. I was completely scared to death of him all over world except one person. Luxembourg. He just watched, understanding what was an artist's actual pattern. Classification 3 Martial. and the girl who had attracted the attention of others candidates was very surprised, thinking Luxembourg was calm, even too much with that situation. And it was almost like that kid was simply a legendary martial artist. And as half the crowd had fallen to the ground, the queue became a total mess. Luxem took the chance and asked the test person to go soon. The guy ended up looking at him and saw that he was very calm and let him go. Luxem ended up putting his hand on the machine and its vitality was 15.7. There Jean Fang ended up your eyes at the same time. Since that kid, he was just at the most. The official tried to reassure him, saying he could take the power test of combat. How many times I wanted more. Luxembourg ended up replying that only once was it enough. He punched using his stellar impact. And the living room glass simply broke, and everyone ended up seeing the number appear, which was 15,709. Far above Zai Jianfei. And the increase in combat power was very absurd, much higher than the expected standard for that vitality. And at that time the employee got very nervous, since Luchin's skills surpassed even artists' classification 3 martials, and he couldn't just give him a note right there, and needed to report the association, and genius like that just couldn't pass. The guy ran away, willing to risk his own career to give an answer, decent, and quantizo. The Luchin didn't even know if he could leave. But suddenly, Zhong Jianfei appeared and extended his hand and presented himself. Luxin ended up squeezing back, and the impact of the grip was very brutal. Zhong Jianfei was even more shocked by this. And from there, the crowd began to surround Luchin and ended up turning into an absurd mess. Everyone wanted to get his attention, but no option. He ended up running away. Outside the association, there were some girls waiting. And one of them was Luke Incher. They were waiting for a girl named Young. When Luxembourg left, 15 ended up calling him, and he wanted to know what the hell her little sister was doing there. But she hit back, saying she was the one who should ask this question, since he only killed class and was sleeping all day. I thought didn't explain much, and I just said I had something to work out, and asked why they were there. And the girls were Quint's classmates. One introduced himself as a Feng fan, and the other one is called Chunyu. They were there to accompany Yang and Colin. And the fanfare even thought the Luchin was cute. He thanked, but the sister made a face very ugly, and he passed his hand on her head and said he was leaving. And after he left, the mood among the girls got a lot worse. Phil clearly didn't want any of them as a sister-in-law. And at that moment, Ian Cullen ended up arriving. And it was that same girl that had drawn a lot of attention from the guys in the evaluation. The girls asked if she had passed. Ian Cullen said he didn't want to talk about it. Explained that an incident happened, and the evaluation was closed. Unfortunately, she would have just to sit and wait. And it made them all very surprised. Then she blurted out that a demon had appeared. It was a guy her age, with a vitality of 15.7, and a greater fighting power than an artist, 3-star martial. And she thought she was very talented, until they see that crazy guy just show up and put everyone in a flip-flop, then got pregnant, and asked if she knew that guy's name, and Ian blurted out that the name of such a demon was Lux, letting it fill up completely boggy. And Luciano himself was walking quietly in the street, eating a good cupcake. Near there, some guys from Ranchuan martial arts rotated the area, clearly looking for someone. But his cell phone started ringing again, and it was the medicine room guy insisting. But Luxury ended up completely ignoring that guy. And he wasn't in any hurry, and already in the head, he was still thinking calmly what would be the way to make money, using the medical prescription, and no impulse action. So the scene ends up changing to Luxem, again in Dreamland, and he asked me to retrieve his biography. And again different information appeared. Now he saw a future where he became a level 2 martial artist, shocking the whole city, and entered the field of wonder training of Dongning Province. Graduated 3 years later at Dongguing Martial Arts University, and joined the army. And he even had some promotions, but at 50, trying to reach rating 7. He unfortunately failed and died in a monster trap in the city of Bear at 87 years old, and that ended up making the Luchin even more right of a thing. The future could really change. A week ago, his destiny was to die at 37 as a rated 4 martial artist. Even this new future, it was still trash for everything he really wanted. Pro world, that change was temporary, and rating 7 was no big deal, since the future demanded much more than that. So he at that moment needed to reach the peak of martial arts, since I had chosen this path and wouldn't go back or screw. More cutting to dinner. An old man ends up writing with a brush as he spoke on the phone, and across the line, a former leader was complaining a lot. The mustache thought he was being made fun of. And your name is Xiao Yur. Director, assistant to the Association of Martial Artists of Bear. He had already accepted that in that city, No geniuses were born. It's been 100 years since anyone stood out there. Without resources, anyone minimally talented would go away without thinking twice. And the former leader, warning that the training camp was coming, and the Ur was very surprised. If Bari didn't send anyone, it would be a gigantic shame. And at that time the city's reputation was at stake, and that ended up making the Ur very furious. He wailed. He had no genius and could not resist, did not have access to resources and was under arrest, writing useless symbols. It ends up reflecting that rising level like that was really impossible. Only at this moment his assistant ended up walking in the door without knocking, and that alone showed that things were very serious. She apologized, but said something absurd had just happened in the evaluation. Since an year-old martial artist appeared, level 2 with combat power over 15,000, and the king at the same time ended up freezing, taking the tablet in her hand, and sent her to show the scar at the same time, and when he saw the Luxembourg, he ended up getting a scare. He started murmuring about the kingdom's fighting technique, perfect, but the assistant understood absolutely nothing, and he explained that it was a term from the martial world, and who mastered that level at that age. It had only happened 10 times in history. And worst of all, Lucien was actually poor, and without resources, and he was only. And I really had no explanation for that talent, and the king began to laugh like a madman, at the same time, and do nothing. Lifted the assistant off the floor and started screaming, her saying that boy was a genius, sent to bless the city. And she got really dizzy, without understanding anything what was going on. Then he ended up explaining that there were martial artists, dotado, people with unique talents, that ordinary people would never achieve. He wore his blazer at the same time, decided to go thank in person to Painborg parents for creating such a monster, and changing scenes again. A boy was warning, Ishuan, that I had found all information from Luxembourg. His father worked at the port, in a logistics company, and the mother was a market box. The guy still asked a little suspiciously if Lucien had messed with her, and Nishuan was very angry, cutting it at the same time, saying stop thinking shit. At this time her cell phone ended up ringing, and when I learned of the association's movement, got very excited, sending the subordinate to buy the most expensive gifts possible, for parents, and also for a young, who had finally found him. But the scene ends up changing to luxury by meditating at home, only they end up knocking on the door, since someone was looking for him. And when he left, he ran into Ur, and he recognized the president at the same time. All this greeting and the climate already showed that the life of the luxury was about to turn upside down. And the king really liked that kid's posture, since he was calm, polite, and zero nervousness. This has already shown that Lucien was not just anyone. Even so, Lucien wanted to know who that girl was, and his mother introduced her as Ni Xuan, and she commented that they had seen each other in the center of martial arts, and he remembered at the time. But the king got straight to the point, and said the association wanted gift to Lucien with the insignia, second-level martial artist official. His performance had been completely absurd. In addition, his intelligence would be equivalent, that of a level 3 martial artist. But that doesn't stop there, since for the dancing talent, decided to give a few $1,000,000 as an incentive, and at that time his family almost shut down. Parents thought they were dreaming. Agreed, who was in shock, holding the mouth because his chin was practically falling to the floor. And the king still said he was waiting for Lucien, continued training signatures, and shine more and more. Lucien only but made it clear that he didn't believe in free lunch, and wanted to know what the association wanted in exchange for him, and Yuri ended up being very surprised with the boy's maturity. Sighing, he ends up getting a letter and talking the real thing to him, wanting the luxury, participate in talent training, Dane Gewing tribe. And here in Shiz couldn't take it, and ended up getting up at the same time. She knew that field was only for the elite, but it also destroyed talents, and told that a genius from her center ended up going in there full of hope, and came out broken completely, became an ordinary person. And she warned that Lucien's future was bright, and that he didn't have to risk it like that. But the king and I didn't deny the risks, but said that place separated real talent from illusion, and he was sure Lucien was very different, would still leave the decision entirely in his hands. Luxembourg ended up getting the letter, and said that he also thought that he had not yet arrived on its own edge, and the king smiled, and said he would be back in 2 days, to look for that, and said goodbye. Nishuan was already leaving, and was called by Luxembourg, who asked why she had gone there. But she ended up getting dyed cheeks, finding him much prettier in person, and explained that he wanted to invite him to be honorary of the martial arts center of Omjuan, but the Luxembourg had no idea what it meant. So she ended up explaining that disciples, fees did not need to show up. I had always trained when I wanted to, and everything was free. Best possible assistance, and without any responsibility, only title. She knew the 18-year-old kid at that level. I was going to make the center name explode. Even so, Lu Xianhou ended up thanking, but refused. Nishuan despaired, trying to offer more benefits. But he was very clear. He had no problem to say he was training there, nor to cooperate. But I didn't even want the title. And if it were in those terms, it was okay for him. Otherwise, nothing done. He would still do the tests there, because it was so close to your house, and he was also lazy to go further. She ended up accepting, but making it clear that the title or on time was exclusive to Hong Xuan, and said he would send the police straight to his house every month. After that gone, Lu Xianhou's parents were still completely in shock. The father did not believe that the president of the association had gone directly to their house. And Lucas made it clear that it wasn't a dream. Juan didn't have to turn night at work anymore. Dad didn't have to destroy his back on the job. He now made enough money and could support their whole family. So finally your parents could rest. Then the scene ends up changing to the medical room, and laughed, almost freaking out. A whole week and nothing of Luchin's name. She searched every possible corner. And the worst thing was knowing that his studies had given insane results. The liquid was stronger than most of Class 3 remedies, full of benefits, and almost no side effects. She then hit the table very angrily, and the scared Muffy cleaned the floor. Until he let loose that he had found the Kai, and pointed to the monitor, and the news showed Luchin, approved as a level 2 martial artist, at years old, with name and all, and the re almost under the chair, sinking in the pillows, not believing the genius she was hunting. It was just a train, but setting up stage in the sea of trees, a bird licked well, until luxury passed flying at an absurd speed, throwing water everywhere. And he himself ended up being surprised that by combining the power of the fixed start with the dreamland lighting technique, his agility ended up exploding for good, and decided to name this step movement Cloud Chaser. He reached the top and stood still, watching the sunset in silence. Lucy Hino logo ended up entering the natural breathing technique. With every breath, he reached the energy of the air directly to your body, and the effect was constant. The physique regenerated all the time, allowing him to drop their own limits without stopping. At the same time, he felt everything around, nature changing, the rhythm of the world, the harmony of the universe. In that state he managed to resist blood and what grew out of it in a way completely absurd. He had gone there just to get pill ingredients, but ended up advancing in cultivation without even realizing it. In that year of the world, humans, they had not yet discovered the true value medicinal those herbs. Luchin had already placed the order at the foot of the mountain, so everything should be ready. And before leaving, he still wanted to test the cloud's pace, to see how long it would take to go down the slope. But the scene ends up cutting to the base of the mountain, lonely, and Luch arrived asking if the order was ready yet. The seller ended up confirming and showing all he had, and he checked and saw that the herbs were very fresh, and everything was right, then warned that he wanted 10 bags of each. The seller had already arranged with him 500 per bag, only with a crooked psycho smile. He changed his conversation at the same time, and said it wasn't 500 anymore and now it was 1,000 per bag, and still played the final condition, that Luchin would have to buy all the herbs there. Lu Xianhou just kept looking with that face of those who were not understanding. No shit, that weird salesman's talk. But the guy swore the kid had stayed deaf, reinforcing that he spoke right, and still made it clear that nor was it from the forest of trees. So he was bound to follow the rules there. And the weather was already weird when 2 bums appeared with a knife in their hands, ready to delay his side, and the seller still blurts out that it was better. The luxury is not included. Only these guys. Unfortunately they ended up messing with the wrong person, and they came finding themselves threatening, saying that everyone there was a level 1 martial artist, and they went all out. But the luxury was pretty good, and just lean against a rock and end up splitting it in the middle, and the guys got absolutely no understanding. With this, Luxton still asks in the greatest calm in the world, when exactly was he supposed to stop playing? And suddenly, they all ended up changing at the same time, kneeling like a dick's ass, and started to apologize, saying they were blinded by greed. But the Luxembourg, without wasting time, get the herbs he wanted, and the seller, all in shock, says he could take whatever he wanted, and all this would be on the house. And Luchin puts in a whole basket, and he even warns by seller to be honest with customers. And nobody there wanted to fuck. After seeing the kid simply cracking a stone in the hand. The next day, the scenario ends up changing to Dongming route. In the training field of talents, the place looked more like a base, military than anything else, and the Luchin sees that everyone there had the insignia, military, and it is doubted whether it was foreign, since his was there all cute. It trained his mother took. And now it has beaten his fear to take a beautiful sermon. Right on your first day, the military ends up coming, asking why he was alone, and where he came from. and Luxembourg ended up warning that he, unfortunately, delayed, and the other candidates started napping, laughing at his face, finding it worrying that the city of Beirut had only sent 2 students this time, until the military with intelligence confirms that that was Luxembourg, and was the student cited by the president of the association. And then ready, Jarrell takes the kid as the president's darling, thinking he was just there for connections. But the military ends up cutting the gossip, sending everyone to shut up right there, and warns that Luchin can come in with the staff of the city of Queen Ruan. Begins to such entrance ceremony that Luxembourg thought it was very weird. But out of nowhere the gate began to close, and the people end up panicking, thinking it would be locked in there. But the military orders to calm down, saying the mission was to find the way out on the other side of the passage, to pass the test, and wish good luck. They are all over, getting angry because it became a test, simply out of nowhere. And suddenly everyone started to fall. The Luchin rests on the floor gently. No drama. While there were people crying and freaking out, without understanding what the fuck had happened there. But he starts to feel the atmosphere, and realize that this was not a common passage, had beings there. And his mental strength makes a lot of difference. And Quantitiso, a guy named Lin Xiaoyu, thinks it was all very boring. His comrade is really pissed that he got hurt, not knowing it was a trap. And Lin Xiaoyu ends up releasing that those who don't adapt doesn't deserve to be a martial artist and doesn't want to be associated with a weakling like him. And the weather ends up putting a strain on them. Until a girl ends up remembering that everyone there is from the same city and they should unite, and Lin Xiaoyu ends up agreeing, wanting the city to shine. But someone ends up suggesting playing Luchin to explore the place first. Even because he wasn't even from the city, the girl thinks it's pretty rubbish, since the idea was to use the bait mulk. Even so, some end up agreeing with Lin Xiaoyu, but Luchin ends up asking permission and decides to go alone. And Xiaoyu ends up being surprised by his initiative, and says he can join the group if he shows. Result, but I fought real boss, saying that predator walks alone, and that only prey walks in packs, and this ended up making Lin Xiaoyu very angry. Already threatens to kill Luchin if he continues playing the leader of that group. But out of nowhere come several balls around Luchin. And they were magics. Giant robots, stronger than level 1 martial artists. Only a detail, there were many of them. Lin Xiaoyu already thinks that test, it was to kill everyone who was there. Since I just had nowhere for them to run, and a Luchin, I knew those robots could hit head on, even with an artist, level 4 martial. And it was the first time he saw it live. Lin Xiaoyu ends up calling the kid crazy, thinking this would activate and come out, grinding everyone in the punch. They all started giving Luchin, as if he had died, but the girl still asks him to be very careful, and he even tries to punch the Luchin. But he holds the blow with only one hand, and Lin Xiaoyu even started to smile, thinking the kid had taken one with everything. But they are all in shock when he realized that Luchin had just held that attack. And he even said he expected more, lifting the robot like it's nothing, and already damaging everything, squeezing so hard that ended up completely destroying me. And the crowd began to wonder if that kid was really human. Lin Xiaoyu, wanting attention, started laughing out loud, saying Luchin was fooling everyone. At that moment, that's where we, and that he just got there by luck, calling the kid a piece of shit, saying even level 1 he shouldn't be, and to prove he was the brab, Lin Xiaoyu decided to go after one of those. Thinking that only he in that place was good, and that the rest was everyone involved, Lin Xiaoyu ends up giving the a kick in the head, that comes out spinning, and the people from the same city has already begun to think that we're all fake. Cured Peppo, and the soy, thinking he's a hotai, tried to prove it to everyone, when his head falls to the ground. Only they're my friends that give shit. In the same second, he ends up fitting a punch well and in that crazy guy's face, and send the kid flying straight to the wall, while putting a gigantic and beautiful hole in it. Lin Xiaoyu all bursting. Warn everyone that those is. It was actually rating 2. And everyone ends up panicking, realizing that they were surrounded by those things. And then they start looking at the Luchin, wanting to know what the hell his rating was, for him being so calm like that. Only the Luchin already knew that every ghost had a core. Just got the point right. And ready, and for him it was already getting even boring, that battle. But do nothing. A gate ends up opening, and a boy who controlled this is completely lost, since he wasn't understanding, because they had just stopped working. They knew. And the Luchin ends up listening to the guy talk, and ends up releasing it in the greatest in the world, that alls had simply been destroyed. Still asks if the second challenge had already begun, and the poor controller ended up getting completely blank. The guys end up calling him the doorman, and he didn't even know he was the doorman, and Luxem already thought that was the next challenge, and walks towards him, full of killer intention. And the guy ends up getting his mouth open. And Quantuizo, a white hair mine moves in the control center. A guy with a mug in his hand. Think that would just be another peaceful day. Until I realized she was right there. And this woman's name is Shrek. But she hates being called that. The guy's name is Xiaojun Kim. And she asks him to look for something useful to do. Since I was so busy, Xiao Jian ends up sitting down and asks if she has ever seen the quality of that year's students. And she replies that only E really met your expectations. And so they started to watch the candidates fighting. Xiaojun notices a style girl and gets very interested. Shuikun ended up confirming that martial artist, Si Quick was more impressive until now, almost rating 2, and her name was Lin Xia. The Xiaojun began to drool a lot on the shaken's egg. But she ends up cutting him at the same time. And he continues that the candidates weren't even that bad. Until he saw something that ended up making him very scared, and the scene ends up changing to evaluation room 7, and it was thrown with everything against the wall. And Shilin had done it with only power. Her. And that was the last. Yet she felt something dangerous in there. Something that was appearing to be rating 3. But that wasn't part of the evaluation, because he didn't show up to fight her. But when she goes deeper, she is caught by several security guards with criminals, and she tries to understand what the hell they were protecting, and use your mental power, and feels 2 people on the other side fighting. This ends up her. Because the test was against robots and not humans, and the Luchin ends up noticing her at the same time, since he also used this ability. And his look made the Qilin just freeze. At the same time, she closes the door with everything shivering with fear, trying to understand what kind of thing I had just faced, and Xiaojun and Shuiku, leaving the room to see it up close, and the Xiaojun asks information from everyone who entered Corridor 12. And suddenly luxury appears, having destroyed the gate at the base of the force. The security guards end up saying it was just a student, only after realizes Lux was carrying a guy. Disagreement. But Shui Qin ends up recognizing that guy, it wasn't a Kim Yoon character, and asks who the boy was. Lu Qing ends up presenting himself, saying he came from the city of Barry, and Xiaojun thinks that kid was too crazy, and had a lot of courage. He not only destroyed the expensive robots, how did you still hit the supervisor? And the half-dull Lu Qin ends up explaining that it was a misunderstanding, thinking that the supervisor was also part of the evaluation. Only at this time, the Shui Qin ends up releasing his energy towards him. But instead of attacking, she ends congratulating Lu Qin on spending time in the input evaluation and send him to rest. She then ends up reviewing the videos and realizes that Lu Qin was very different, since all those robots were just toys in his hand, and Xiaojun ends up showing in the records that Lu Qin had only 15 of vitality, but he simply had 15,000 of combat power. Shui Qin ends up revealing that he tried to analyze him with energy, but felt absolutely nothing, no reaction, until it asks, like someone like that could be controlled. She decides not to draw conclusions yet, but send priority to treat Lu Qin, since that year seemed to be very good. And Quantum Lux thinks it had been a scan, and he knew her power was at least 5 times bigger than his, and he had hidden all his own energy, but I knew she noticed something in him. The military calls for meal time, and take him to the canteen. Lu Qin is very dull, asking how much he can eat at that moment. And the military said he could eat at will, since it was the first meal. And the problem is that Lu Qin just started stacking a bunch of plates. Without paying what he ended up leaving, even the military, very scared of that kid's hunger. And soon after a girl ends up approaching, asking if he was Lu Qin, and she introduces herself as Yang Yuan, from the same city as him, asking if he remembered her, of martial arts evaluation, and asks to sit next to him. The Lu Qin answers in the Qin that he will not give. Food was limited, and she could get her own. And that ended up making Juan very angry at the time, because she didn't want his food, just wanted attention. And the Luxembourg remembered what the president had said, that the city of Bahia did not have many representatives, many years ago. He gets confused, but the Yuan explains that it wasn't quite like that. The city even sent people every year. Or problem is that almost no one passed the entry evaluation. When passing, ended up being asked out, for not scoring enough points, so Luciano ends up asking what the hell is these such points. And the inn ends up explaining that the point there was basically none, and their everything just spent points. Lighting equipment, Hunex, instructor classes, and even monster meat in the canteen. I could only earn points, passing tests and ratings. Until that moment, only 3 people had scored points. He then ended up listing him what the names were. Kaom. Rating 2 with Stone Skin Owner. Went Re, also rating 2 with De. A Speed. And the most talented of them all, that was Jia Lin. Martial artist. The strongest of that year. Just at that time, Qialin ends up passing through the canteen and sees the Luchin devouring a gigantic chicken. And she almost dropped the tray, so in shock that she got. But ends up fixing everything with his power. And then the one ends up asking if Luxem had any chance of meeting Qialin, but he ends up replying that they only got hurt by chance. He then asks if only these three had passed. And then one ends up explaining that he had a room, only the guy was completely crazy. He beat the instructor until he sent him to the hospital and still destroyed all the robots alone. She says it half laughing, like it's too absurd to be true. And Luchin realizes there that he won. I was thinking about him. Even without her knowing who was talking with the very guy in her story. She even comments that she'd rather believe someone like that didn't even exist on that exam. In the end she said that only a real talent comes in there, and that with time and intelligence. Believes that Luchin, I wouldn't be behind those three. The Luchin just coughed pretending everything was fine. When it appears two employees saying he needed to go to interrogation, and the reason is that he destroyed magnetics. And even left a supervisor unconscious in the hospital, and then the one ends up freezing. At the same time, realizing that he was sitting with his own demon of history, the Luchin all baggy, asks if he could take the food on the trip. Because I was still very hungry. And incredibly the guys just left. He ends up saying goodbye to Johan and leaves, and the other students ended up being in shock, seeing that rumor was really true. And Johan starts to remember everything he said, and it started to sweat cold, because she got the guy from everything named, and not knowing it was him. But the scene ends up switching to the command center, and Shui King comments that Luchin was from another world, since he managed to roast half a year of their budget in a matter of minutes. There was worth tens of millions. And none could be fixed. Still decided not to punish him, since I was just doing his evaluation, and Xiao Zhou ends up arriving with all the approved ones. And the Luxembourg ends up watching them all, and Qialin was clearly very afraid of him. Shui King ends up congratulating them all, and explains that the stronger they are, more resources they receive, and she ends up handing them point cards. The approved were very happy. And the Qialin sees that she has gained 100 points. Enough to take class with. Legendary instructor. Only she ends up realizing that the luxury car, it was completely blank, and everyone ends up strange at the same time, and the luxury itself thinks he has gained absolutely nothing. Until you start calculating prices. Monster meat, 5 points. Training room, 10 points. Instructor, 30 points. Chief instructor, 100. In his head, only the meat was worth it, and the Xiaojin gets angry, thinking Luchin should be much more generous. Since his card wasn't blank. He actually had 1,000 points. And in the end the chief instructor prevents any training. Then Luchin, I just shouldn't do anything at all. And the other appru were clearly outraged by this. And one of them finds it very disappointing. Favoritism for Luxembourg. And a big guy began to accuse Luxembourg to be spreading rumors and breading people, saying it doesn't make sense. Someone with such weak vitality gets so much prominence. And if the field was that the strongest earned more resources, so Luchin had to prove his worth. And so the weather ends up weighing a lot in that room. The floor Zhou is worried, but Shikin tells not to interfere. Luchin doesn't even seem interested, but the big guy ends up insisting, his stone body. Challenging the Luchin, but Luchin ends up responding with a simple flick. And the human boulder just flies away. Shutting the mouths of everyone who was there. Luchin gets a little scared, because he didn't want to cause harm, but that crazy bastard was asking a lot for this humiliation. And the others who approved were in shock, while the Xiaojin took a very relieved breath. Since the damage wasn't even that big this time. And as if nothing had happened, Luchin asks if he could leave by now, and Shaken ends up weirding, asking what his training plans were. Saying he could use the dots and ass instructions directly with her. Luchin thanks, but ends up refusing, saying he had more important things to do, and Xiaojin thinks this is pure arrogance. After all, he was turning down the boss, instructor, commander, but Luchin ends up explaining that it wasn't. He just wanted to sleep. And the two approved, left without understanding absolutely nothing. The Shuikin ends up getting confused, while the Xiaojun had a lot of fun with that situation. Luchin then goes to your room, and Xiaojun didn't believe that kid really went to sleep. The Shuikin thought it was all very strange, since the dormitories didn't even have the resources. Even so, she ends up commenting that that boy was a resident. Very interesting, and Xiaojun doesn't quite understand. But the Shuikin explains that Luchin was actually a first-line stone. Someone who made others grow faster. Just kept there. And she ends up remembering the Dane Peng from their time, and Xiaojun remembers at the same time, and even feel pain in his chest. The guy had crushed everyone in training, and became absolute laugh of the camp, and who said that's exactly what she was talking about. People who have a physical gift end up dominating at first, but strength isn't everything. Growth, experience and adaptation told much more than that, and those who depend only on the physique end up being left behind. and she thinks this could be Luchen's future. Too, but the scene ends up changing to Luchen, fighting a gigantic zombie. It blocks the monster's attacks, and break the ground to win advantage and take down the enemy. And then absorbs the memories, and discovers that the zombie was a rated 6 martial artist. In life, on the same level as President Ure, and Luchen realizes it wasn't that simple, since he needed to use energy to block the blows. And he understands that his strength lacks more techniques, experience and energy than pure vitality. Human strength has limits, and couldn't be good at everything, but he was learning, with countless different paths. Discovering your own blind spots, and his path was complete martial arts. And how he only withstood the blow because of the energy, he decides to focus even more on it. He closes his mind, is concentrated, refines the interior and ignores externals. And suddenly, he feels something absurd. Then he started screaming with joy, because he had finally advanced in level. So he asks for artificial intelligence. Will show his profile and find out who has become an artist, rating 7 martial. Animated, he asks her, look for advanced body techniques, breathing and visualization. With level 3 access, he ends up finding something very strange. And when opening, he realized it was a complete martial art, and the name of the technique was Divine Princess of the King of Hell. Something absurd, without restrictions, specially created for mentalists. And the technique allowed create a second body within martial arts, as if it were a clone that duplicated muscles, cells and even genes, strengthening everything without leaving any scar, and the focus was to strengthen the organs and amplify vitality, just Luchen's biggest weakness. The creator of that technique is called Duan Yinfeng. Luchen is very surprised to think that someone so talented existed, and yet human civilization was not saved. He knew the way forward was too long, and that he needed to get stronger and stronger. But a month later, Shili was training the shoot that observed and praised the rapid progress she had made. She could already control 6 stars very easily, and when it reached 6, would officially enter a level, a mentalist, and Chielin ends up saying that it was all thanks to his instructor, but ends up pointing to a problem. She noticed a weakness in Chielin's mental fortitude. Asks if anyone had ever caused trauma very severe in her, and the girl ends up immediately remembering Luchen's look. Scared, she asks if there is a solution. Shuikin ends up responding in a cold way, that it was enough to find the person who caused the trauma and defeat that or kill it. So the trauma would really go away. At the same time, only Chielin was completely terrified by this. Shuikin didn't quite understand this reaction from her. Chielin was evolving too fast. So theoretically, it shouldn't be that hard to get over that. But for Chielin, the fear of Luchen only increased. And the worst part was knowing he was wasting time, just sleeping. If his abilities stagnated, then yes, she might have a chance against him. So the scene ends up changing to Shaolin, asking Shuikin what had happened. And she admits that Chielin was very strong, but her character was too weak. But the Shaolin ends up bouncing, saying that even so, she was much better than Meng Jihen, that he was training, and in the end the Shuikin ends up concluding that they were teaching what day. There were only 2 months left, and it would all be over soon, and the Shaojun didn't believe Luxin was still the same. Just sleeping. The team that brought food always saw him sleeping, and for him Luxin was already a hopeless case. He asks if Shaken still intends use Luchin as stone. Irritated, she blurts out that Luchin wasn't worth it, nor what the cat buries in a box of sand, and says to just forget that boy. But the scene changes to Ayuan cleaning up the place, when another girl shows up to help. And the girl ends up complaining that, while some gained 100 points, enough to live peacefully for 2 months, they had to save even on food, not to starve, and she asks if Ayuan had news about Luxembourg. But Yuan knew absolutely nothing. He made a huge impact when he arrived, but the next day he looked like someone else. And everyone knew he got locked in your room sleeping, and some thought he had realized that physical talents lose advantage over time, and decided to hide to create mystery there. Owen deep down didn't believe much in it. The girl then sends her to rest a little, and promises to finish the job. And at that moment they end up hearing people whispering about Kai Young was about to face the gravitational force, quadruple, and Xuan ends up being very shocked by this, as he almost did with 20 minutes in the duel, and another girl ends up pulling her by the hand to see it up close. Even so, Yuan, he's satisfied with what Luchin would be doing, but the scene ends up going back to Luchin, who is still in dreamland. And Quanto caution was holding for 4 minutes in the triple gravitational force, breaking his own record. And the crowd starts to bother, finding him very amazing. And he finds it curious everyone to have a party because of it. And I could already imagine the impact when I reached the quadruple. A student comments that he will soon give up, and the Kion asks how Luchin was. And the guy replies that Luchin just kept sleeping. And that boy even had some very strange dreams. Sometimes the Kion thought it was all very arrogance. 1 month ago, he had no chance against Luchin. But now I thought I could handle it quietly with him. In his head, Luchin became just a waste of 1,000 points. But in that moment Luchin ends up coming out of nowhere, and he asks permission, and goes through the Kyonj at a speed. Absurd. He sees the training room, gravitational for the first time, and find it very interesting. The Kyonj attempts to provoke the, making fun of him sleeping the whole month. But Luchin wasn't even calling that. He just comments that he didn't expect to spend that many points on food. Luchin then decides to start slowly, with 3 hours of training, and says he didn't even notice. Who spent more than a month. But I wanted to test how much stronger he had gotten, training. But no one believed that he had evolved. After all, the crazy guy just slept, and the Kion suggests a warm-up, but Luchin ends up completely ignoring. And at that time level 2 gravity is activated, and the Kion think Luchin he's going to get screwed for not taking it seriously, since the pressure could even break through her organs. Only the Luchin didn't even seem to be feeling that effect, and he starts to move with a very absurd fluidity. Everyone started to pay attention, without believing what is moving at that moment. Luchin ends up liking that test, and finds everything very innovative. And do nothing. He starts touching the dashboard, and Kion thinks he will stop. But it wasn't quite that. The pressure increases, and even those outside ends up feeling the pressure. Everyone ends up going into shock when you see that gravity has been lifted 4 times. Luxem ends up feeling the weight, but shows no difficulty. And so he ends up putting his hand on the floor, and balancing one's own body. And everyone at that moment was worried. Shilin passing by, tired from her neck, noticed the commotion, when she sees the Luchin sustaining himself in gravity, using both fingers. She was completely incredulous. The Kion was speechless. Just getting to wonder, how could that guy be so strong like that? The Kion couldn't swallow it in his head. Luchin had spent the whole month sleeping, so he should have reached him by now. Only very quiet luxury found that quadruple gravity interesting. Deciding you've seen enough. It ends up rising 5 times high. And at that moment the whole room ends up going into shock. Some even thought about calling more people to watch, and inside the camera, Luchin ends up the natural breathing technique. In the Earth's breathing mode. And the news ends up spreading very fast, since gossip spreads fast. And Lin Xiaoyu ends up being in disbelief. At that moment, the general comment was just one. Luxembourg had returned. And Kion just watched. Very scared, seeing Luxembourg can handle gravity. Quintupl's like nothing. And Luxembourg realizes that wasn't enough for him yet. He needed real pressure. Something that pushes its limits to the extreme. Then he goes to the dashboard, and people outside think he'll turn it all off. No one believed he had lasted so long, so in 5 times, only Luchin starts to push the buttons. And the crowd ends up panicking, and the short scene for Shui King, who wasn't happy about it, as 2 more students had given up on training. And Xiaojun tries to minimize, saying that not everyone could bear to suffer. But Shiz, saying that whoever can't stand pain would not survive in a real battle against monsters, and the curious Xiaojun opened the cameras thinking it was just more people trying to break the record. Only at that time it ends up freezing. Someone had broken the strength room record, gravitational, and the Shui Qiminhe thinks that who did it was the Kion, but Xiaojun reveals no and says that it was Luchin himself who did it, and he was enduring gravity. 8 times increased. Shui Qin almost ended up breaking the glass she was holding. They didn't even know for sure what was his rating. But one thing became very clear. Was the kind of person they were looking for. It's been a long time. Inside the camera, Luchin was very panting. 8 times gravity was too heavy for the vitality he had. And yet he decides to test his new technique. He builds an inner heart, and feels the vitality increase at the same time. That was the real power, from the divine cloud of the king of hell. And excited he decides to see how far he can go. When he goes back to the panel, people go into shock. He had already increased it up to 8 times, but it increased even more. And the pressure ends up exploding, simply outside the room. And some fall to the ground. Gravity reaches up to 10 times. And the Luxin is crushed against the floor, that cracks completely. He can't move even 1 finger. Using all the energy just to not be turned off. And that was exactly the limit that he was looking for. Outside, then the man watched all that, and understands that Luchin had really returned. But after all that, Luchin ends up leaving the camera completely exhausted. A girl ends up handing him a towel, and he thanks surprise. And when checking the points he realizes he spent as if he had trained 3 hours. Even getting much less. In compensation, he gets a reward for breaking the record. The total rises to 4,335 points. And everyone ends up being completely in shock. While some multi-amputees did eat meat, he had enough to do damage. Luciano keeps walking, and the people pave the way, curious to know where he was going. And Xuan ends up watching it all very scared. For her it was like seeing a tiger walking, with a bunch of smaller beasts following behind, and your friend ends up asking if his vitality had already reached classification 4. Then Xuan ends up freezing when you realize his destiny, which was the movement angle in there. Meng Jinri just finished training with a completion rate of 87%, and he was feeling really cute. Thinking there were people watching and being inspired by him, when he looks around, realizes that no one was giving him the slightest. Everyone actually, it was concentrated on the other side of the corpse. Curious, he'll see what was going on there, and discovers that it was Luchin himself. At the same time they began to laugh, calling the Luchin lazy, saying he never set his record, even if he tried 1,000 times. And the guy who was next door ends up strange and releases a question that cut the mood. Who the hell was Meng Jinri? And an absurd noise ends up echoing through the silence, and Meng Jinri ends up crashing. All laser launchers fired at full power. Awakens ends up understanding at the time that the challenge was not string, and Ya's reaction, since it was not possible to predict where the laser came from. That was exactly the fun of learning. Even so, all that for him was absolutely nothing. The beams began to fire, but he deviated from them all. Meng Jin King was speechless. As well as everyone who was watching. There was no pattern, and there was no way he could anticipate, but the Luchin just dodged out to get rid of everything. And very scared, much, pulls the guy who was explaining all that situation, and asks if it was really Sleeper's first time there. And the boy ends up confirming, and still loose, that before that Ufsm had broken the gravitation room record, thumbing in 10 times. It didn't get on the Cane Meng's head. Luchin didn't train. He just slept, and yet the difference between them was very absurd. But his shoe, I was also very strange. This boy's performance, that didn't look like a premiere, looked attractive. When she sees the Luchin reacting even before, of lasers emerging, she is sure, and ends up trying to weld it again, with energy. The Xiaojun ends up realizing, and asks what she was doing, but she tries to disguise, since she finds it very strange, because you felt absolutely nothing coming from him. Even so, he decided to observe him again. Luchin likes, and feel your movements getting faster and faster, and ends up completing level 2 very easily. And those who watched did not understand how that could look. Something as simple as that, and Xiaojun realized it wasn't easy. It was perfect physical control, and Shuikun comments that she wanted to see how far could that kid go. And the Xiaojun understands that the two were thinking the same thing. And at that moment Luchin ends up starting level 3. Suddenly, several balls are launched against him at the same time, and the weather ends up getting too heavy, with Minj and Ri getting too tense. Luchin ends up deviating from everything, but lasers activate by surprise. And now it really was starting to get very difficult. The fish positioned themselves precisely to block the escape routes. Luchin ends up the difficulty, but ends up forcing your body, and ends up robbing in the middle of an explosion, and the two instructors ran out of reaction. That was something that even an artist, ranking 4 martial, would have a lot of difficulty longing to do, and the Xiaojun ends up getting very excited about all this. His gift is speed. And the year-old boy was already at that level. And when a laser gets too close, Luchin understands that he could not depend only on intelligence. He too, to relax, and ends up using the breath of the wind. His body accelerates so much that those who watch just ends up losing sight of him. It was like he was gone. And the result appears on the screen, which was 100% completion. And Xiaojun ends up realizing that Luchin was on another level. It was time to go, but the Shuikin didn't want to go, and she was completely right. Since the Luciano ended up starting level 4, and everyone ends up going into shock again, because that was very absurd, and new mechanisms end up emerging. Completely different lasers. And everyone now thinks it's impossible to pass that test. The Luchin is even surprised, but can handle very well, but Xiaojun decides to stay, since it really needed to be seen to the end. Feeling like you've reached the limit of the wind's breath, Luchin ended up divine intelligence, the king of hell, and the world ends up simply slowing down. In his vision, time seems to stretch, and he recognizes that at the time was the sense to scream. And at that moment Luchin ends up reaching the metamorphosis, and it was something unique to mentalists of classification 3. He had officially entered the ran of level 3 mentalists. And Shuikin feels the urge and almost loses control. The universe began to crack, and a wall ends up exploding. Now there were no more doubts, Luchin was a mentalist. Shuikin ends up his power, scaring everyone around. and Xiaojun thinks she has gone crazy for good, but she said she wants to test Luchin again and develop a skill against him. And even in the middle of training, Luchin ends up perceiving and defending himself, and the Shuifen ends up feeling clearly his power was not inferior to hers. But the limit ends up coming, and Luchin realizes that the sense to cross consumed too much energy. And he had already done half level 4, using so much wind breathing. As for divine happiness, and at that moment it was all his vitality could handle, and he ends up letting a laser touch his body, and the silence closed. Final result was 56% completion. Even so, he overcame 97% of martial artists in foot and movement were. The generator ends up exploding in hydration at the same time, and Main Chi King leaves there feeling complete rubbish. He always thought he was the best, but after what he saw, realizes he was way behind Luchin, already the protagonist. Even though I knew I had crushed everyone, was not very satisfied, and know that it existed 3% above him in feet work and movements, only ignited his will to train even more. And the Shuiken ends up congratulating the Luchin, remembering that he not only broke the strength room record, gravitational, as well as the movement angle. And she asks what would be his next step, combat or training. And Luchin's answer ends up completely breaking the weather, since he just wanted to eat, and Shui King gets a shitty face at this time. 3 hours later, the two instructors end up calling Luchin for a simple review. He is Shuiken shows a standard blood collection needle for measure its vitality, and Luchin comments that in his room, even managed to its own skin, and Xiaojun finds it impossible and sent for a golden needle, made for martial artists, level 5, and with her will finally make it through the Luchin's skin. And the result was 26,4 of vitality. Xiaolin was very impressed by this. A martial artist so young was already at level 3, it was a very rare thing. He then asks for the combat power test, and Luchin decides to go with everything. Use the breath of fire, increases stellar impact by 8 times, and matches the improved lighting technique. And that blow ends up blowing up the machine, and the result was 271,920 of combat power. And it was simply a level 4 rating. And Xiaojun ends up going into shock. And at the time he declares that Luchin, it was practically foreign, and could leave when he wanted to, and says it will send the report to correct the level, is in martial association. Luchin ends up thinking, but the Shuiken interrupts him, saying there was still a test to go, and she ends up showing a rare energy crystal, discovered over 100 years ago in the Land of Lions, and was used to measure power. First she ends up putting her hand, and the result gave 143,2, and the Xiaojun ended up noticing that she got much stronger. But she ends up giving him a dry slap in the face, saying at least she trains differently from him. And Xiaojun accepts the offense, less about your lifestyle. And when the Luchin ends up putting his hand on the crystal, Xiaojun teases her, saying I wanted him to become Shui King, and she ends up getting really angry about it. But suddenly the crystal shines too brightly. Very strong indeed. And the reading appears, 20,3 of purity. And Shuiken ended up in shock. That was 5 times higher than her index. And it was absurdly rare, since it took her 2 years to raise her own purity, and Luchin at only years old already had that insane level, and for her, he couldn't even be called a genius anymore, since it was something far beyond that. Xiaojun started drooling egg, praising the kid non-stop, and Shuiken gets angry, because he was stronger than her, and punch him. And then ends up asking if by any chance, Xen had a master. He answers yes, since he was taught by a mentor, who passed an art single cultivation in use of energy. And this ended up relieving Shui King a little, and it would be very scary if he had arrived that level alone. Even so, she made it clear that he was extremely strong. Asks me then, how long ago had hit his powers? And Luchin ends up answering that it was 3 months ago, and the two instructors were in shock about it. Shuiken concluded that it would hardly appear another monster like him in the next 10 years, in the association of mentalists, and Luchin ends up being, when hearing that there is an association specific for this, and he explains that it was different from martial association, since only 1% of the Iranian population diffs, and she thinks his mentor ended up hiding it, not to disturb the training, as can harm cultivation. Even so, offers a touch staff for him to join the association, securing resources and support. More luxury. Ends up admitting that he never met his mentor personally, which has always been oriented in a very accessible way, and Shui King finds it even more impressive. And someone who finds talent like that would even treat it like a treasure. But Lux knows he couldn't explain everything, and deep down that his mentor was someone 10,000 years old in the future, 11 rating martial artist called Duan Wingfi. But that was just for himself. But in the end the Ground Jun ends up interrupting the conversation, saying he still had pending matters, and he ends up delivering a card to Luchin, warning that there were 5 million as an extra reward for his absurd performance. And Luchin ends up being very surprised by this, since you could see very well in his face that I was very scared of this award. As Shui King made it clear that that value was the maximum possible, because the Eastern Military District budget, it was always too tight, and Xiaojun ends up dropping here. Add up to everything that Luchin had already eaten at camp. The damage easily exceeded 8 million. And Luchin had no idea about it, since he thought the attractions were practically for free. And as Shui King then ends up warning that it wasn't just about money. And Luchin had already drawn at the same time as the military district. Oriental wanted to recruit him, and Xiaojun ends up confirming, saying he got it right. The Shui-kun explains that a prodigy like him, sooner or later, would end up on that. Martial artists are not born to live in comfort, and that's why they receive so many privileges. The country needed real strength, but Xiaojun is still trying to sell his fish, saying that the Eastern Military District had the most beautiful female soldiers in the country, and all of them with some very generous almophadamus. Shui-kun was outraged by what she was hearing, and sent him to shut up at the base of the chair. Then it reveals something really unexpected. Luchin was chosen as camp representative to participate in tomorrow's star selection. That year, she ends up explaining that every year, the eastern provinces make a camp to choose the supreme genius, someone who had absurd potential, even among the Jin. Wei from Morning Star was basically being a martial information master, and only one was chosen in every eastern district. And Xiaojun makes Luchin think about it very well, but he ends up accepting it on the spot without hesitation. Oh Luchin, I knew I couldn't run away. Then I was waiting for him, and he was trying to change the fate of mankind alone. So he needed to become something unstoppable. In addition, the reward would be much greater than any cell. Common, he wanted more resources, and knew I needed to show more than I had ever shown. And the Shuikin ends up warning that it was actually missing a few months for selection to start. All camps needed to end first. And Xiaojun was sure that all Eastern District colleges would beg for Luchin to enter. Luchin then ends up deciding to stay there for a while longer, and when leaving, Shuikin realizes that for the first time, I was envying someone's talent, and Xiaojun was sure that the Luxembourg would cause many absurd changes in that era. But at dinner, ends up switching to the Bay City Martial Association. And Trembor goes to the president's office, and already hears a bookstore. Yuri was very pissed about Lai arguing with the boring old man. The secretary ends up seeing the dime and sends him in. At the same time, the old Shia that was filling the president's bag received luxury with a smile on his face, saying he was very funny. And the problem is that old Shia was Chilin's grandfather and her #1 fan. And he made it clear that he didn't think luxury better than your granddaughter, only me, and laughter were completely out of patience, and asked why Luckton was there, since the camp wasn't over yet. But Luckton ends up explaining that he just went there to deliver the documents of Shui King for evaluation and approval, and old Chia ends up weirding it out a lot. A document going directly to the president of a small town. It was very strange, and he starts to think luxury did some shit, and that Yuri had recommended the boy, and so he would end up paying the duh. Yuri opens the envelope very angry, and freezes at the same time, and even trying to stay on top. Old Chia ends up losing the ground completely. That when Yuri asks, since when the Luchin was a rated 3 martial artist, and Luchin replies that it had been about a month, personally evaluated by the chief instructor, and the Yuri opens a smile, and ends up tasting at the same time, and the old Chia gets very dissatisfied, ripping the report out of the president's hand, and when he reads all that, he just ends up in shock. Since it was rating 3, and combat power above 270,000, and he quickly ends up accusing Luxembourg of falsifying all that, and Yuri ends up cutting on time, saying no one would forge a military district seal, Oriental, so that document, it was really legitimate. The old man ended up getting lost, since in his head, Luchin had been eliminated. None of that made sense, and the Luchin sighs and clears up at once. He never said he was eliminated from the camp. And that was the old man's head thing, and he still speaks to the president, that if there was any doubt, just called the head instructor. And Yuri ends up playing in the old man's face, who didn't need it, but still decides to make a video call with Shu Kim. She answers and presents herself, and the old Chia almost at the same time, since he was really a Shui King. To make matters worse, Shilin hears his grandfather's voice and appears on the call, very attractive, only a Shui King. It doesn't even moralize, asking if the girl hit the goal of the day, and still gives a sermon on her, decreeing that the governor would be multiplied by 10 times. The old man ends up getting suspicious, seeing the granddaughter being treated like garbage by the instructor, but Yuri tries to relieve the weather, changing the subject, saying it would solve it all. About Luchin. Shiken ends up dropping a bomb at the same time. In 1 month, Luchin will represent the genius camp from the cloud of Dong Ning in tomorrow's star selection in the Eastern District, and all because he was the strongest prodigy. That year, Yuri ends up being disbelieving and happy at the same time. Today old Chia started to sweat very cold, while Shui King continued to pull Chia Lin's ear. The old man ends up going into a mental breakdown, finally turning on the dots about the monster his granddaughter was mentioning. And this monster was Luchin himself. Before switching off, Ashukunin ends up asking to speak directly with Luchin, warning that he has already received most of the materials for cultivation he asks. And she will send the price list, and explains that if he then did a mentalist evaluation, could buy it all by myself. After connection, Yuri ends up bursting with joy, and asks if that was really true. The Luchin then ends up explaining that he was evaluated with a gift, and because of that he ended up getting a letter of recommendation. Or president. Almost jumps with happiness, and the old Chia on the other hand, sinks once and for all in its own shock, and leaving the martial association. Yuri treats Luchin like a relic, even wanting to get someone to take him home, but Luxury ends up refusing, getting in the car and saying goodbye at the same time. Deep down he understands better than ever who can command in everything. Motorist comments that you can see that he has a relationship very strong with the president, but Luchin ends up denying it, saying the Yur was just a really friendly guy. Only right at this time, the car ends up hitting a fallen plate, and it was board of Hong Xuan martial arts. And inside a guy named Lin Tiaken. He thought it clear that he didn't come to negotiate. He came to challenge everyone. And Ninhuan thinks it's too low, since her father was injured, and the old Inhuan claimed that he was not recruiting students, only next year, but Lichiakan didn't care about that. To him, if someone was hanging a plaque, have to endure when they come to try to break it. Iomeiru and Sean replies that he arrived alone in the city of Barry 20 years ago and built it all with his own fist. And he gets into a fighting position, even hurt, while his daughter gets very pregnant, and the Chuan Bet ends up teasing him, saying he would be defeated that day, and ends up asking about the Luchin. He wanted to know how Hong Xuan formed a ranking martial artist, 2 years old. And Nesh Xuan gets angry and says Luohan wasn't a student, was just a member. Only Lin Tian Chan ends up stepping on the ground and cracking everything around him, saying he didn't care about it one bit. And he was very angry, since because of the fame of Tran, half of his gym business went to waste. What if Hong Xuan had the guts to mess with his pocket, and to endure catching, and neither Xuan ends up hitting, saying that the students left of their own free will, and nobody stole nobody, and Xuan Lin ends up ignoring it, since it was enough for him to destroy that. And ready, without the Hong Xuan, students would run back at the same time. More to me, Xuan ends up closing the face, and declares that he will not let this happen. No way. Since she will fight to the end. Olichi and Xian find it funny and says he's going to crush that little flower once and for all. And Hong Xuan knows that his daughter was not stand for that guy. And even more, with a guy being an artist, ranking 4 martial. Saying Holt, he himself would already have a hard time beating him. More to Nichuan ends up rebutting, saying it was rating 3, and that joining forces could still turn the game around, but Tianqian ends up losing patience and call them all to hell. Nichuan promises you will make it, and load that gem sign, and parade around town. The big guy ends up going upstairs, but the father enters the front blocking the attack, and he ends up getting the whole impact, and it's thrown too far. And Lin Tier Chan starts talking a lot about him, calling him old trash. That's when Hong Jun realized the truth. That guy was rating 5. Seeing that there was no way to win, or Xuan Ram agrees to close the, and says he will seek martial association. And listening to this, Ni Xuan started to cry a lot at that time. And Tian Chan very possibly prepares to leave. Until suddenly Luxin ends up arriving just in time, saying that couldn't close, because he would have nowhere to train. Ishuang ended up getting very confused, and the Luxin ended up greeting her, and Tian Chan's henchman noticed at the time why the students ran away from there. Tichin tells the guys to shut up, and praises Luchin's stance, inviting him to train at the Tichin, promising to teach their secret technique, something that would make the user virtually invincible. Luchin ends up in the offer and starts asking questions, and the Likey Chan is already getting angry. More before answering, Luchin ends up releasing some of his own strength. He tests and sees that the guy was tough, and ends up throwing a very dry punch. Richie-chan goes to the ground, rolls and just knees, and the Luchin still ends up mocking him, asking how he intends to teach someone in that position. And the henchman ended up going into shock at the same time, lifted the Tiachin in a hurry, and left. A Xuan runs to her father, and Luchin ends up approaching, asking if everything was okay, and asks not to close the game, since there was no other near his house, and he really liked that place. When Mei Hong Xuan is deeply grateful, and says he will never close the doors, and the Luchin makes it very clear that he doesn't want a reward, only ends up explaining that power was law in that world, and that they needed to strengthen themselves. And after he leaves, thanks Quan still tries, understand how a level 5 martial artist, wasted by an year-old boy, with a single punch, and Anishima ends up remembering that 3 months ago, the trend was rating 2. But the scene ends up moving to Luxon's house, and the mother complains about his delay, but he said he saw people celebrating, old and weak on the way, and decided to help. And she got very pregnant checking to see if he hadn't been hurt in that process. Quiet and proud father says the son was really doing the right thing. But your mother ends up asking about the meat he brought. Ask if it was from the camp, but Luchin ends up explaining that he actually won. And the mother ends up asking if his training was difficult, full of concern. But your father ends up saying she cared too much, and comments that he feels something big growing up inside your child, and Luxembourg is very happy to hear all this, since deep down he only thought of one thing: get stronger and protect the family, and keep quiet days like that. Then, the scene ends, cutting to Luxembourg in dreamland, and the guy has already reached chaos, exchanging blows with a giant zombie, and just go through the monster's body, with an absurd drill. Zombies rated martial artist 6. He was pushing with just a punch. Without any effort. Confident, he advances to the center of the base, curious to know if I would hit that zombie. With a dominant aura that he had felt before. And the idea was just to take a look, but fate didn't leave it cheap. The zombie ended up noticing him, and already throws itself at him, without notice. I fought as soon as I had time to block the attack, and already feels absurd pressure. The vitality of that thing. It was completely off the curve, something that a rated 6 martial artist would never last. And at the time he ends up having a certainty. That was martial master level. Even managing to stabilize quickly, with the crystal visualization technique. He wasn't thinking of backing down. It beats that impulse, now it goes, and decides to fight that bud. And without wasting time, Luciano ends up the wind's breath, increasing everything by 6 times. And ends up sending a stellar impact with it. Just it got bad, since his attack did not cause absolutely nothing. 0 damage, and he walks away on time, really scared. Because I had pretty much used everything he had. There was no doubt about it. That zombie had been a martial master in his life. No option. Luciano ends up breathing in the fire, and forces the stellar impact to the maximum, 10 times stronger. And here comes the heavy performance. The old man was protected by an invisible shield, and he ends up remembering at the time of stories about martial masters. That own strength field, so strong that not even a bullet could go through. That was really a master's strength field. Martial complete. The weirdest thing is that the zombie, I wasn't even trying to attack. He had no intention of killing, and was only passively defending itself, and Luxembourg ended up feeling a very psychological bang. He just didn't stand a chance at that moment. None of your attacks came close to dealing 1% damage, and from the bottom he even thanks because that creature doesn't see him as a threat. In the end, it was clear that like both worlds, work differently. In his world, rating 7 already made someone a martial master. In Dreamland, no rank set, the guy was still just an ordinary martial artist. Even so, Luchin wasn't giving up, since he needed to find a way to defeat that old man. If he could do that, he would have access to the memories of a martial artist, and it would completely change everything. He started beating the old zombie down, but it was like he was punching a wall. Even so, gave him to feel that the old man's force field was weakening, so it really wasn't invincible. And the problem is that his energy, it was also ending, since he depended of natural breathing to maintain. He ended up getting in doubt if it continued to its limit or back off to try later. But in the midst of it all, he remembered the energy. Something he never used to fight for real. And that always served only as support and reinforcement of vitality, with the divine cloud of the King of Hell. Even without offensive mentalist technique, the brute power was very strong. So he decided to take a risk, and he attacked again using his energy. And it worked until a little. But unfortunately not enough, and he forced further to crack the force field, but still not enough. And no limit. He decided to make it all out. Energy. Fire breathing, stellar impact multiplied by 10, and the perfect handle technique. And so it was with everything on top of the zombie, who until then was only peacefully defending himself. This time, the force field really broke. And the zombie was very surprised. Luxembourg felt that he could now absorb everything that guy knew. But that weird zombie ended up just smiling. and soon his memories started to invade the mind. Du Luxemar, and his name was Xian Ning. Martial master who lived in the worst moment of humanity. He sent his family away in an airship, but stayed to fight to the end. He ended up facing a level 9 monster, one with the British, and still believed in human hope, and learned by watching Wayne, laughed his own martial art, but died before he saw any better future. Shen absorbed an amount absurd memories, and all the life and talent of a fist master. Now it was simply his, and the luck of the fist advanced directly to maximum discernment, taking control deep, and the pinnacle of everything Shen Guning built in your lie. Among the memories, a name always appeared that it was one Ri, the only Eastern alien, star-body creator. Shannon Ning even witnessed one of his attacks, and from the adopt a supreme technique, and these memories were buried deep, until Shen ended up finding a sphere, and was pulled into it. There he saw Shanling before a colossal creature, releasing an energy that destroyed everything, and that represented the combination of the master's lay, martial, and technique, created to achieve the 8 raying. Ten call over the same sky, and now this skill also belongs to Lu Chen, but back home, he realizes that his energy had changed completely. The quantity was very similar, but the quality was very absurd. What if before the others were air and water? Now his was pure steel. A simple touch, he made buildings, pull and lift gigantic objects very easily. Was at least 10 times stronger than before. He also felt the martial master's force field around your body, still fine, away from the zombie level, but it was a seed, and he knew that with time, this seed could grow a lot. And so one day she could turn into a giant tree. And when that day came, he would reach martial master level that he always looked for. But the scene ends up changing for him. Sitting on a chair waiting for the laugh to come, he passed the address, but she ends up being late. And he was already kind of in shit, because he left the camp and he ran out of daily meals and monster meat. Without it, he would urgently need. But, so talking to the Ree was a top priority. When she finally arrives, she was dead tired because she came running. And looking at him, she ends up getting very surprised. Thinking that as he really was just a character, that was going to be too soft, Lu Chen tells her to sit down, and comments that he heard that the meat from the restaurant, it was very good, and already calls for lunch while they talk, and here ends up sitting, not knowing where she would start. And before she thinks much, Lu Chen already orders 40 servings, the best meat in the restaurant. And then looking at this, think that kid, it was practically a horse to eat that much, but even ends up accepting the idea, because after all he was a martial artist. But soon he does the mental math, and almost goes into despair. Being so he doesn't send her to pay for all this. He still asks if she wants anything, and she tries to answer, but he already cuts her at the same time, telling the waiter she didn't want anything, and orders to bring everything quickly, because he was so hungry. It then ends, realizing he was very rude, and barely let her speak. And the worst, Luciano starts to pour it all out, everything you know about her family. Great-great-grandfather started as an apprentice at the Lao Jean store, and ended up becoming a grade 5 alchemist, and founded a Shan medicinal hall that arrived to have 213 branches. And at first it was very prestigious. But management went to waste, and business began to sink, and a Lincoln thought it was very strange that he knew about all this, things I would give to find on the internet. And at that the meat ends up arriving, and the Sheen gets all happy and starts to devour without pain. While he chews, he plays in her face that she never knew her own mother, that her mentality was, and that her mother with the Sheen family. Anna supplied it in the medicine room years ago, and I laughed and ended up getting very angry, wanting to know how he came to that conclusion. Elo is Sheen very quiet, sent her to confirm with her father, and he keeps eating, like nothing is happening in front of him. I just thought this kid just had no heart, because the subject was very delicate, but ends up admitting that the decline started when the mother abandoned the father, and the stores started to fail one after another, too fast to be just a management, and the luxury still loose, that she tried several projects after, and none worked, and Ray is increasingly shocked by this. He said he didn't want to look so invasive, for investigating both, and she starts to believe what he was talking about, not the guy investigated so much, that soon he knows, even the color of the girl's delicate clothes, but the girl ends saying he will investigate on his own. Yet she ends up forgetting the subject of collaboration. But Lucino goes straight to the point, and he takes care of the prescriptions and the training. They sing medicinal hall. Dane takes care of production and sales, and the profits of everything. He wants 90%. And the laugh almost fell off the chair saying that so put, then the firm bro will fail. It's better to ask for everything at once. Loco, she even tries to buy offering 60%. Maximum 70, only the kid is tough son. He refuses at the same time, and says 10% was to ensure the long-term partnership. And the other 10 are bonuses for her helping to deal with some things. And she understands absolutely nothing. until he explains that the family lass has been bullied by the capital's Shane family for years, and asks if by chance she doesn't want to fight back and get back what it was hers. As she speaks, he makes glass water levitate and laugh. Freezes at the same time, realizing he was a mentalist. The year-old boy with that level. It wasn't something she expected, and he still makes it clear, who researched a lot of prescription alone, and ends asking her if there was an agreement better than this. Rethinks very well and realizes that if everything is true, the confrontation with the Sheen family was inevitable, even if she doesn't want to. Revenge. The other side will not spare the partnership, but O'Shane would be a perfect excuse to start the war. And in the end she ends up realizing that that kid, it really was pretty absurd. She accepts and 90% would now be for him. And at that time the snack ends up delivering a pen drive with the medical prescription and just asks her to register the petition in the Association of Alchemists and says that any doubt can ask him. And he trusts her ability. And still borrow the lab. How he already finished eating. He ends up saying goodbye and just leaves. And the Ree stays there lying in the chair and shit, realizing that he didn't deal with a simple homicide, but with someone of very heavy status. Yet above, a girl arrives asking her to pay the bill, right now. Simply he was the one who ate it all, and she now that she's going to have to pay, and the price of that little game was 115,000. And the worst thing is that he had more food, because Lucien still asked for more food outside. And the Link almost bursts from so much hate from him. Sunita ends up moving to Lucien's house. The doorbell rings, and his mother ends up opening the door, and it goes expensive with several boxes. And he ends up explaining that it was high-quality meat. The mother complains that he should have warned, because meat was very expensive in that world, but he sends her relax and said he didn't pay anything, which was actually a gift from a rich artiera, who was his friend, which in the case was all a lie, since Lingxiu was crying paying the bill. But his mother ends alerting so that he doesn't accept the gift of others, and ends up commenting that the Zhengguo teacher stopped by to find out how he was, and Lucien realizes it's been a long time who didn't see his teacher. So he ends up deciding who will spend there the next morning. So the scene ends up changing to the third high school from the rear, with teachers and Guan on the table, end up knocking on the door, and he will see, and ends up getting a scare when he meets Luxboard again. To make matters worse, the kid still gets a good gift for him, since he had destroyed the old, and the teacher ended up being very happy with his presence, even because I could already feel that the energy of Lucien was completely different. And so the two end up going in to talk a little. The teacher thinks that the whole paperwork for Lucien to leave was almost ready, and that unfortunately your student would only come on T from then on, and ends up asking what his plans were, and the Lucien ends up releasing who will participate in tomorrow's star selection, and still take the mentalist test. And the teacher almost at that moment, since that kid was really a machine, Lucien ends up explaining, which was an indication of the training structure. Sengo was very proud of him, and tell the boy he had nothing left to teach him, and send him just to go outside and leave his mark on the world. When Lucien leaves, the teacher realizes that he underestimated that boy ugly, and thinks he could become the pride of mankind. But the scene ends up switching to the classroom. The teacher already gives that classic speech about persistence, essence and reality full of mystery, and send a book on the table to wake everyone up, warning anyone to underestimate cultural studies, just because I was focused on martial arts. And Quantitisa or Yujixang, Ji was finding the class a bag, and ends up calling Lu Hing to play. Then Lu ends up refusing, saying he enrolled in a training school, martial and has extra oxygen, and Zhu ends up weirding it out a lot, since the guy never studied much. Before rendering more, the teacher ends up calling them both, and reminding you that they are in a classroom, and do nothing. Lucien ends up entering the room, greeting everyone. And the whole gang at that moment ended up in shock to see him there. Everyone already knew he had become the highlight from the city, and some even wanted an autograph, and the teacher could only smile very proudly. Lucien asks to attend a cultural studies class, and here, only his time was completely different. Even Wadenmi realizes that his friend has changed too much. In a short time, the bell ends up ringing, and the class ends very quickly. Luciano ends up saying goodbye, and the jail feels honored to have been his classmate. But he still ends up replacing the Kimin, and send him to do his best, and call to play someday. Kimin gets very excited, and decides he is going to enter Martial University, cost what it costs. After that the Luxon was already at home on the computer, and had already made the link to buy materials for tonics, and with enough quantity. He thinks he makes it safely to level 4. Or problem, it's actually the mentalistic weapons, since without going through the official assessment, he cannot buy anything online. So at that moment he started looking at prices. Eternal blade, silver, and dense steel scrap, very expensive. If it were to forge straight, I would spend millions to do that. Even more so because his energy was too strong for ordinary blade. Conclusion, he would have to use Mephril. Only that. just made everything 10 times more expensive, and then his plug falls. He would have to mine these materials. Simply alone, the working fire seed repositories. He ends up finding a strategic map, Mach 300, and discovered no Meferi mines, explored on Oxhead Mountain. The plan was made clear. He needed to prepare the tonics in the lab, and then go to the mountain. Maybe even profit if you found a lot of material. And a week later, in the same medicine hall, Ling Su was very angry because Luchin hasn't arrived yet. When he appears, he takes the lab coat and apologizes for the delay, asking if the materials were ready yet. She ends up confirming, and it all cost about 200,000. Luciano likes the quality a lot, and have it deducted from the profits, and says it will begin. But first ask her to get out of the lab right now. And the beautiful one doesn't like that at all, but it's clear that the kid knows exactly what I was doing. In the end, the beautiful one hadn't made a penny yet. She had already toasted nearly $1 million in materials pro Luchin, and the worst, he showed up every single day of that week. She was already getting paranoid, wanting to know if he really was creating another recipe, medicinal, and how many secrets that kid still hid. 3 hours later, Luchin warns that. Also says that he will travel, but send her to relax, because it will transfer the initial capital to Messins, and the beautiful one just got more and more angry, finding that kid very hard to deal with. And as soon as he leaves, she runs to the lab to see if he left anything back. And yes, he had left, and she flaps her eye, and understands at the same time. That was another tonic. One she had tested before, and knew it was absurdly good, and medicine of that level used to be worth million. But he had made them using very cheap materials. Then the profit from it could be just insane. She still ends up remembering the luxury backpack, and gets even more nervous, wondering how many new tonics there were in there. In this, an ugly one appears, saying that he checked the cameras, but it seemed like everything had been a problem, and Ling Su understood at the same time, against the mentalist. Trick of this kind was funny. She ends up throwing a green liquid in the trash, and decides to forget all that, and just collaborate with Luchin, focusing on revitalizing her family. So the scene ends up changing to Cumin City. Luciano was on the bus, going to Oxhead Mountain, pretending to be just a tourist, and Urbaye ends up explaining that the place was a tourist attraction, 5 stars from Dunking Province. Full of local culture, tourist village called Xeling, and crafts to sell. But the people were very suspicious, fear of being a tourist blow. But the guy guarantees that no one will be forced to buy absolutely nothing, and that in the inn also had air conditioning and tea. The Luchin had already prepared 93 tonics, enough for now. And that region was so isolated that my mind hurt, probably didn't even have been discovered along the way. A little girl ends throwing him a ball and asks him to play with her, and the mother appears apologizing, but Luchin says he didn't care about it. But at that very moment he ends up having a scare, since a guy with glasses nearby was also a mentalist. In Quantum Iso, a pink-haired girl named Azing Dandan. And was very bored, and she was sweating, so much that he regretted coming. Her friend named from Lizenchin remembered that he didn't force her to do absolutely nothing. She came because she wanted, and she also went there because a relationship had ended. And I didn't want to be alone. These two girls were inseparable. And the weather ends up changing when the child ends up playing the ball, again to Luchin. He ends up praising the pitch, and the dandum starts to notice him. But the ball ends up going towards the dandum, and she gets all excited, and plays for the Luchin. That appreciates, and the girl got all pregnant. At the same time, the Zishan, who is not silly or anything, already realized that your friend had liked the guy. But hours later, Dandan thinks that place is just an ordinary forest, while the Zishan comments on a waterfall to visit the next day. But the Dandan starts looking for the Luxin and sees that he was getting off the bus. The little girl ends up calling him to play the other day, and he ends up accepting, making the whole child happy. The Dandan tries to approach, calling the girl to play with them, but ends up taking it out at the same time, because she stole her ball. But the little girl's mother ends up calling the child, and goes away, and the Dandan is very angry. But the luxury asks her not to take child stuff seriously. She understands, ask for his contact, praise your name, and then say goodbye. And then ends up commenting to Zishan that the trip started very boring. But out of nowhere it got pretty interesting. But Luchin also found it very curious. Plus a rank 2 mentalist. Those two girls were also artists, same level martial. Yet, he had, sure that guy in the glasses didn't have, discovered who he was, and after forming the will of a martial artist, he could control totally the energy that emanated, and if he wanted, would just look like an ordinary person. At that moment, he only had one goal. What if someone became an obstacle? He wouldn't have any problems stealing from everyone. On the way, Accent ends up cutting to an input of hundreds of kilometers from there, and a limousine ends up sliding smoothly, and the weather was very heavy inside, and a boy was perched in front of a long-haired guy. The subject asks if he found the Tang Malin. Subordinate ends up confirming and delivering the location. That was on the mountain in Avok's head, since Tang Malin ended up taking his wife and daughter there, and the hairy one ended up realizing that the Tang Malin got stuck at the bottom of the mountain. So there wouldn't be much they could do at that moment. But the subordinate warns that there are already people watching that place, and it pleased him a lot. Even so, he ends up making it clear, I wanted solve all this with your own hands. And this guy's name is Yoshinjing. And this crazy guy didn't want look like a coward in front of no one and do nothing. A purple liquid ends up oozing from his mouth and eyes directly to the cup. He says that young aura of 20-year-olds. Off love. It was all too sweet for him. In Guanto Miso, he ended up reading the photo of Tang Malin with the family and decides that he will add a piece to his collection, which in this case would be the Tang Malin's own daughter. The scene ends up cutting to Malin entering the room with his family, and he ends up using your ability to scan everything that was there. And the environment was apparently clean, but his wife thinks all this he was doing, it was an exaggeration, and says that it was unlikely that the Shinjin got this far. But Malin ends up disagreeing at the same time, since it was better to prevent, they were running for their lives. And Shenlin was a level 3 mentalist. Very close, grumbling and vindictive to the end. Malin's plan was quite simple. Survive and protect only your family. He wants to take refuge at his father-in-law's house, join forces, and hold the Tijin. The wife cares about her father's health, but Malin believes he was doing very well. He is also a level 2 mentalist, or maybe even level 3. What mattered was nobody touching his family. But the scene ends up going back to Luchin, and he also does recognition, only on a very absurd level. It just sweeps the whole city, and detects even Ting seeing henchmen watching in the area. Other than that, there was absolutely nothing strange about it. As there was no one filling his bag, he just relaxes and takes a pill, calculating in 2 months, close the first stage of the golden immortal body, gathering internal energy, and becoming an artist, level 4 Marcel. Only at this time, he ends up getting a message in the family group. He finds it funny, because he wasn't a child anymore. Chimshay was gossiping, asking if Yan and Nanhan was dating his brother. But he ignores mentally, sending her just to take care of her own life, and remember to take the tonics every day. And ends up lying in bed to test the recent results. And apparently, it wasn't bad at all. And ended up learning the 10 suns about the same sky, very quickly. And also managed to form a martial master's force field. And at that moment, was virtually unbeatable, and in the dream world he kept killing zombies. Only now everything exploded around. Until suddenly, he ends up feeling something very strange. It was an absurd time, and ends up with a woman wearing armor. And it was a zombie too. Only that woman, it wasn't quite putrefied yet. And it made the Luchin get really scared, since that woman's level was martial master level. But simply out of nowhere it ends up disappearing, and at that moment his perception only screamed in danger. And when he realizes the attack was already coming your way, and it was a martial master level technique, and he just got hit full on. At the same time he ends up with insane pain, like his body had been crushed. Dying in the dreamed world was one thing, really very brutal. And got panting, and thanks for being just in the dream, since he used all the energy to block. But it was simply recorded. That zombie was too strong. Far above what he had ever seen. Much stronger even than Xin Shengning. Probably rating 8. The shock came too heavy, and he thought the dream world, it was very peaceful that I could do anything he wanted. Because monsters were so dumb. Only he missed badly, since that was not a learning experience, and he starts thinking about that river of glowing ice. If he had something like that, maybe you could adopt a lot longer. If he had reacted immediately with the wrist technique, maybe he could handle it, so he ends up deciding that he will try again. I just couldn't take it anymore, since every time he entered the dream world, the pain came back with everything very strong. It even looked like a recharge time, like in a game. And he understands who can't go back that night. But in the middle of it, Dandan messages end up arriving, calling him to go for a walk. But he doesn't answer and she calls him to lunch again. In nothing, Luxon was already starting to repent of passing the contact on to that girl. But in the end he ended up thinking better, and decided to go out to eat. He went to the boredom. And Dandam shouted his name from afar. The little girl also ended up calling him. He ended up greeting the child and sat down on a table. The Dandam practically flew and sat with him, already asking why that he hadn't sat with them. And he just laughed to break the mood, and asked if he had ever eaten. Dandam said no, and Zishan said yes, leaving her friend completely irritated, and the Danda ends up making up some excuse just to eat with him. The Tame's daughter, Malin, asks permission to eat with Luxon, saying he was just a little unbearable even. The mother tries to stop her, but the Tang Malin lets, only for his daughter not to cause trouble. But his wife ends up getting too tense, remembering they were running away, and Lu Qin was a stranger. But a little eye ends up looking strange, since before she was complaining about excessive caution. He explains that he has already analyzed everything, and there are only tourists there without any danger. Says the Lu Qin looked like a martial arts student, with medium skills, and that the two girls are college students, ranked 2 martial artists. If he wanted, anyone there would die with just thought. And his wife finally ends up relaxing a little. The food ends up coming, and it was an absurd pile, and the dandan asks if he will really handle it, to eat it all alone. And he ends up asking the little girl for something, and proposes a competition to see who eats the fastest. While the girl was eating one by one, he just turns the whole basket at once. Iyas and Chan think he was just an ordinary guy. Martial artists usually live on supplements, or at most special food. And she and the dandam carried in truth compressed dried meat. What if they ate like him? Would spend all day in the bathroom. And dandam was very impressed with his hunger. Azichan questioned directly to her if she had been interested in the Lu Qin, but Danton denies it. At the same time, your friend tries to put judgment, saying he was very young and stable breathing. And maybe it's not even strong. Danton prefers to believe in destiny, thinking I had to be there to meet him. And if ground starts to list a lot of problems. Long-distance relationship, low salary of non-martial masters, home car, real life, and the stronger the Danton got, the biggest would be the difference between them. But for Danton none of that mattered. Continues, she could help him train, could have a house and car on its own, could even drop everything to live a life simple with it. Since she just wanted to be with him at that moment. Since I thought he was very handsome, bright, and with a good future. And Zishan thought her friend had really gone crazy for good, throwing out over 10 years of martial arts, because of a teenager she thought was weak. And the dandan thought her friend cared too much. And changes the subject, and the detail is that Lu Qin ended up hearing all this, and thought it was kind of ridiculous. The little girl asked what it all meant. And he said it was nothing, only words used to praise pretty girls. And ends up pointing to both, and says they are ridiculous too. Little girl ends up agreeing, and the two of them understood absolutely nothing. The next day, everyone ends up gathering near the bus, and they are all waiting for the Tang family. Alan did go out. Only they just ended up fading. Not only them, but Lu Chen is also gone. And the guy tells everyone to rest while she goes to trigger the search team. The dandan was very excited, and the Zizcheo was very fragile. But the dandan decides he will climb the mountain to look for the Lu Chen, same friend of hers, finding it very impossible. But the scene ends up cutting to a squirrel, very quiet in the forest, holding a walnut, until Lu Chen spent the year, sending the bug away. He risked it, and the pain of the dream world had subsided. He makes a giant leap, using energy to locate something underground, and finds, uprooting the earth, he ends up seeing the Mifari for the first time in his life. He ends up infusing his energy into the mineral, and confirms that he can mold as he wanted. That there's also like 4 or 5 policemen there, still raw, and to become a weapon. Had to go through dozens of mergers. And it would be great to overarm hurt in the end. That mine was small, and he had already taken 70% of it, and now that the real problem has come, since like he can carry all that without attracting attention. Lucy then realizes that he couldn't carry all that alone, so decide to ask for help. For now, he ends up hiding hurt me boring he on the floor and makes it well disguised. And he ends up remembering that he had a village, a few kilometers away, and isolated people from the world, tends to be very simple and honest, so he could just pay to help. And of course, if someone got too greedy, he already knew very well what to do. Crush them all without any pain. The problem is that he himself tends to strange your own thoughts. Sometimes, it's getting colder and colder, violent and merciless. He consoles himself by saying that arriving in a normal village will be polite and good. And the dandan walked through the damn forest, looking for Lu Chen. Zishan finds the little girl's ball, but when she gets stuck without understanding what happened there. And the scene ends up cutting to Cheyenne village. The subordinate warns the village chief that his sister returned with the family. The old man ended up getting confused until his net ran to his hood, squeezing the flight very hard. But soon after his parents appeared. The old man said they just came to visit him, and we already started the idea of hunting an animal, wild to brighten up the night. They then end up taking the little girl hunting, and the old man ends up being alone with his daughter, named Hui Tang Malin. But says that now he wanted the truth, and the Manhwa didn't know how. Speak then Malin ended up explaining everything to him. The old man ended up going into shock when realizing that the son-in-law provoked a ranked 3 mentalist. And deep down I already expected something like this. Here is the day that Malin invaded the village and took his daughter away, but Manhwa ends up asking his father for help, and the Malin remembers that the father-in-law was trying to reach level 3, but the old man ends up cutting at the same time, saying he already failed, suffered internal injuries and damaged their culture, and at most he could buy a little time. They needed to get away from there with the child and look for other help, but the couple don't know where to run. And the old man suggests the policy, remembering that he lives in a legal society. A level 3 mentalist can't go out killing general in public. But the Malin, it solves absolutely nothing. And before any response, a subordinate appears screaming that he has an intruder, and the scene ends up cutting to the Luchin with a map in hand, getting close to the village. And out of nowhere the machine almost hits him, and the resident asks who he was and like he found that place. And before things heat up, the little girl ends recognizing the Luchin and runs to hug him. And at that moment he ends up getting completely unresponsive, and the Manhwa be very happy when seeing the tourist they had met before. And the old man asks how the hell did he get there. Luxembourg then give that standard excuse that he didn't like excursions and climbed the mountain. Although Yotang Melon ends up explaining that that house was your wife. The old man ends up noticing the Luxembourg's clear eyes and like it and welcomes the village. The Kunai guy ends up apologizing and says he was hunting for the night party, inviting Luxembourg to participate. Spending time there, Luxembourg realizes that village was not common. Mentalists are rare. And there were 3. And that ended up making the boy very tense, for if they know the value of Maferi, it'd be a lot of trouble. And he even thinks about showing his strength to everyone, everything to obey in him, but ends up holding on. The little girl comments that she lost the ball, and I couldn't resist with him anymore, but the dime said it could help find. Only right at this time, he ends up feeling the aura of Shem and Dandan, and someone else. The little girl then ends up pointing towards the ball. But the scene ends up changing again, for Sang Sing appearing out of nowhere, holding the Dandan and the Tide Iskchen. And he ends up complaining that Tane Malin made him wait a long time. And the old man recognizes at the same time who was the monster his son-in-law had provoked. And worst of all, Sang Sing wasn't just level 3, he was at the top of level 3. The old man sends the Malin, run with the child, and get the villagers out of there, and the villain's warriors quickly end up launching several funays towards them. Ting Ting gets very bored, calling it a pathetic sneak attack, and says the old man's energy was trash, and that will crush everyone at once. And all that to do the Malin feel true despair in his skin. But Malin ends up exploding in anger and swears he will kill Ting Sing, and so it leaves with everything to attack with all he had, but the Sing ends up cutting off his attack like it's nothing. And Malin realizes when the steel wax cannon dense from him was of no use. Ting Hu still had to applaud the Malin for using a steel gun against him. He thought it was absurd arrogance. And quantum so he ends up his ability straight into Malin's family, leaving the little girl completely in a panic. But Malin, I was getting more and more angry about it, screaming for the Sing in and behind it, and not your family. But the crazy guy was just laughing at his face, calling him. And in a very cruel joke, Sing in ends up squeezing everyone with its webs. He still let loose that he was planning to kill the Dandan, Izishan, and after all that, he would blame Malin and Li. Very quietly, saying that secluded place was perfect to do anything shit without consequence. To make matters worse, Shinji told Malin don't worry about it, because he would leave a wedding winemaid, his own daughter, and the Malinho ends up getting very scared and angry, calling that guy a monster for using an evil art to transform humans in wine, while Shinjin had fun. Seeing despair stamped on his face, existed. Seeing all that, I already knew everyone there would die on that mountain, and she would bitterly regret the trip. And Dandam, on the other hand, only thought of Luxembourg, wanting to at least find him again in his next life. In this heavy climate, Shinjin sent the subordinates to get Malin's daughter. But just in time the webs end up breaking. Webs of my wound were simply destroyed. Shinjin entered at the same time, not understanding what had happened. But that was Luchin's work. The little girl begged to save her parents, and the henchman went after her. But Luchin ends up lifting the two, like it's nothing. Shinjin was very confused, wondering if Luchin was a rated 5 martial artist. But soon dismisses the idea, thinking he was too weak and unstable. Apparently he also had no vital energy. For him, it don't make sense that kid has only broken webs. Even so, Shinji thought Malin was counting on Luchin to be safe and convinced I could destroy that kid easily, wanting to hear screams of despair. But Luchin thought it was very funny, and told him to try to do this. And ended up making Shinjin very angry, who attacked with everything he had. Luchin ends up answering on time, using a martial art in deep control, and Zishan ended up being completely in shock, since the Luchin control was too perfect. And it was a thing beyond the human level. Shinjin didn't understand anything until it is pulled by its own web and falls to the ground. It was at this time that he realized that the thing had gone wrong for good, and thinking he's already going to die, he decided that he would take Luchin along with him, imploding one's own energy and getting like a bizarre meatball. The old man Manhwa drew intention and shouted for everyone to protect themselves. Dandan ended up in total despair. Jiloshin thought that energy of his was pathetic. It just ends, grabbing the guy with his own energy, protecting everyone and leaving. Ting Sing explode inside his hand, and he still found the name Yoshin, but ended up lacking his webs a lot. And soon he ends up releasing the girls, realizing that webs were weapons. Mentalists made of mephiral. Something really, very cute and very useful. The little girl ends up thinking, praising the Luchin non-stop. Tang Malin felt goosebumps. Absurd with that boy's energy, and old Ming War realized he was too old to follow all that, and Malin, seeing that Lu Chen was just a teenager with power, rating 5, thought a real dragon was appearing in the country. And the Aichen was completely scared since she always thought Luxin was and good just to eat. Already Dandan, deep down she always expected something like that from him. And not even knowing how to drive to Luxin, Malin was interrupted when the boy said, who didn't need thanks. Just did what was necessary, but admitted he needed help. Malin accepted at the same time. And 3 hours later, already on the bus, Luchin had fulfilled the purpose of his trip, handing over the matter of the Maphirium to Tang Malin, a grade 2 mentalist. Certified and able to handle lot and bonus. Luxem had still gained a weapon. Mentalist hurt me. The two girls were on the bus, and then asked where he was going. And Luxem said he was going to Leung City, where the Association of Mentalists was located, and the lady gets really excited about it, thinking it was too much of a coincidence, since she and Zishan were from there, and could go together. And Zishan just watched it suspiciously, while Luxem found it very strange. After all, they studied at Dunning Marshall University. No way, a Tace ends up explaining that he was from the city of Leung, and wanted to visit her family, so the tran is over, agreeing that they go together. But I already thought that the best would be split up when they got there. Only do nothing. The Shuikun hat ends up calling him, and ends up warning that tomorrow's star selection had been kidnapped, and wanted to pick her up right away. But Luxembourg said he would be at the regional station in the city of Leung, and so the scene ends up changing to the season. Lochin ended up warning the two girls who had rolled last minute and that he didn't want to go to town anymore. So right there they ended up breaking up. Dandan has already been very pleased, saying I could call someone to take him. And at that moment, a cart stopped almost on top of them, and a girl ran down and hugged the Dandan, all happy in life, and was. Inside the car, a guy in greeted Dandan and asked her to introduce her to her friends. Dan, clearly, I wasn't enjoying that mood at all, but featured Lixian and Luxing, and in the end I didn't even have much to say about him, when you pulled Zexin's hand all excited. And the guy in the car is called calming. Liang said that everyone should be dead tired from the trip, and offered to give a ride. But the Dandan, I realized there were only 4 seats in the car, and ends up saying that someone would have to order a taxi. Luchin said he was on good terms, that I didn't need, because a friend of his would arrive soon. Yui and I found Dandan very bizarre, give attention to a guy she had known on a Oxid mountain. And in her mind Luxembourg wasn't even worth a few change. Without thinking twice, Lian and the Lion already took money to give to Trenmore, take a taxi, and the Danda was very angry with the attitude of the two. Only the dime was still trying to calm the girl down. Only out of nowhere the banknotes started to fly, and everyone got really confused about it. And simply a helicopter was descending right there. Nobody understood what the fuck that was, and Shuiqian screamed for the luxury to rise fast. Like it's nothing. He started to climb the stairs, and the 3 girls were simply in shock when he saw that the helicopter was from the military district, Oriental, and Luchin taking a wave said goodbye to the 3. As the helicopter climbed, and the people around were speechless, thinking he was someone very important. Yiming Leon, I wanted to know who the hell Dandan's friend was. More reactions, even she couldn't explain who he was. No weather, she called Zishan to get a taxi and go to town, leaving the other 2 completely lost. The lady ends up switching to flying helicopter, and it was Luchin's first time in a helicopter, and the Shuiqian asks if he was liking it, and saying that if he liked, could enter the East Military District. And just the way she was talking, Luchin thought she was going to give those kinds of speeches, motivational for him, by those who end up cutting on time, telling him not to dream, but that in the future they could fly every day together. If he became a martial master and became a general, would still win a private helicopter for free. At the same time she thought it was weird, can't see his level. And it was like that kid had gotten very strong again. She tells that all wonder training camps that he closed tasks 3 days earlier, and the candidates had already been chosen. That year's selection was stronger so far. And Xiaojun even made fun of, saying if it weren't for Luchin, he himself would have tried. More than 80% of candidates were very talented and had elemental control martial artists and even a level 4 guy. Luchin wasn't even excited to hear all that, and Shuiken thought of this boy's behavior very strange, and Luchin ended up pretending to be a surprise, as if it were something insane, but Xiaojun thought it was all very false. At the bottom, Lucci wasn't worried about all that at all, and he just thought that the coworker, he should talk about the rewards soon, and then his interest appeared very quickly. Shui King already expected this, and said that the selection was a serious thing, even the head of the army would watch. And she made it clear that it wouldn't be a tournament. Candidates would fight monsters, and the strongest enemies in that world. Creatures that came from the cracks of earth and sky. And even with human heroes fighting every year, their advance into human space never stopped. Luchin did not expect the army to put students against monsters this early. For him, the situation was really getting uglier and uglier. Shui Kingi ends up saying he's right. Powerful countries wanted to reverse the situation quickly, gathering as many jin as possible like Luchin to accelerate their growth, and only with blood and fire, high-level martial artists emerged. It wasn't just the selection that got tougher. Rewards also improved a lot. And that part Luchin really liked. If it was in the top 10, drew blood from another world. Among the top 3, otherworldly pool of blood. And if it came first, he entered the pool of the other world. I thought I didn't quite understand that, but I thought the names were really cute. And Shrek ends up explaining that all that. I like the absurd energy of monsters. The meat he ate at camp was the simplest method. Otherworldly blood under cellular fluid of the monsters and of the other world. It was extracted from their cerebral spine. All rewards were level 4 or above. Something never seen before. Going into a pool like this was like having infinite energy, and Xiaojun said that with the absurd appetite of Luxembourg, he would have to absorb all that when he goes down the pool of the other world. Worth several pounds. And luxury ended up getting very horrified with something so precious being offered. And he knew he needed a lot. Absurd energy to cultivate the body's art of stellar dew, golden body, immortal. He had no idea how long it would take to complete the first step, but if he could, the blood or of the other world could reduce that time in a very absurd way. And that was a really fuck opportunity for Luchin. Until Xiaojun warned that they had arrived in the East Military District, and he asks if the Luchin didn't think he was impressive, but the kid had seen it in the future. So nothing there was messing with him. They end up getting out of the helicopter, and Shui Kane warned that he would return the next day, and if they needed anything, just press a button on the wall that someone appeared to solve. And alone, now Lupton ends up lying down and went straight back to dreamland. And that really fucked up zombie was right in front of him. Just looking at him he was already. But still he wanted to fight, the vitality enhancement technique, and using the breath of fire, mixed with energy, and ignited the divine cloud of the king of Inferno, and was still preparing an impact, star increased by 10 times. As if that wasn't enough, put it all together, with the 10 suns in the same sky, a martial master level skill, and would go on that zombie with everything he had. Just for him to wake up again then. Since he had been killed so fast, that he didn't even notice. Even so, he felt he had gained something very important. Fighting had owned his martial arts. And more importantly, he overcame the fear of death. His mind is gone, getting much firmer and cleaner. But soon after someone ended up knocking on the door, and it was 2 instructors, asking if he had rested. Oshin ends up confirming, and Shuiquin said it was time to go, since the front line was hundreds of kilometers from there, and he thought it was very strange, different from the day before. Xiaojun felt the same way, but couldn't explain. It was like he was a piece of jade covered in mud, who had been welded and polished out of nowhere. Luxembourg blurted out that maybe would have been prettier, because of puberty, and Xiaojun even agreed with it. While they were walking, Xiaojun asked if he was confident to take first place, but Luxembourg did not respond directly until a man appeared greeting Shui King, saying it's been a long time since they've seen each other, and she clearly didn't like him one bit. The guy then ended up looking at the Xiaojun, calling him complete garbage, saying to choose Luchin was to embarrass the whole tribe. The Xiaozhou thought the Shanguan Lin subject must have dinosaur breath, and he better be quiet. And the Lin, all full of you, said that a genius had appeared there and proposes a bet, a medullary portion of another grade 5 world, to see which representative went the furthest. The sweetie thought it was very funny, saying it was 3 against 1, and so the 3 end up turning their backs, leaving. calling him shame. And then the guy ran back and accepted the bet of 3 potions, and was still teasing, thinking she was bluffing. But the pussy ends up getting really whore at the same time, and ends up accepting, and the link ends up calling your comrade called Zoli, praising a lot of his courage. And Zoli ends up thanking, and Xiaojun ended up being completely in shock. Because that guy simply had elemental control of the flames, an absurd blessing, and it wasn't even in his file. The Ali said he had no rule, forcing everything to be put on file, and he was already giving that bet how he wins. Itakum got very angry. But then I pretended it was just acting. Shui King already knew this was common and thought it was Ling. Too pathetic for her. And could clash head-on with that guy. Quietly, and she explained to the trend that the family of Tang Juan always had with Dongjin families. Common era since they kept teasing each other, and since no one had ever appeared really strong from their friendship. They always swallow. Only now all hope was on the Luchan's back. And if he won she would give him her share. And Xiaojun said he would do exactly the same. And when they arrive at the place they end up saying goodbye, since they couldn't keep up at all. He before entering Zhou ends up asking if he was too confident, and Luchin said he wasn't very confident no. The two were left not understanding anything, until he complimented that he was 99%. And if it was dis there, then yes it would be impossible to win. Then the scene ends up changing to the meeting room. And the division commander appeared. And everyone beat continents. He then ends up asking everyone to feel. And was the Major General Level 7 Martial Master, called Yuffie. He asked if all candidates were ready. And Shuikin ended up confirming, and said that the monsters had already been inspected. And each candidate would enter through a different clue, who defeated all monsters, and came first. At the end wins. Each track would have 3 level 2 monsters. 1 level 3, and 1 level 4. And already in the final phase, the monster would be almost level 5, and it was a golden-eyed demon monkey. And the weather ended up weighing in the same hour because that was too complicated. And even lieutenants need fight in pairs to deal with a creature that level. Watrikan made it clear that no one was obliged to face the ape alone, golden-eyed demon. As the proposal was pending, work in a group against the Cascudo enemy. Joining strength was the smartest way to win. Even if that strength comes from its competitors, and the beast got into the matter, saying that the Eastern Military District protected the second front line, most important of the country, and also the second most dangerous, and yet, in recent years, they had been last in the conflicts. For him, we're bringing together the best countries, managed to take down the nearly level 5 monster, so the future was pretty shitty for them. But I did want to know if that time, I really was going to have real talent. But the scene ends up changing quickly, for a hiking trail candidate. And he was running full of confidence, thinking I was a morning star. But at that time a giant wild boar appeared out of nowhere, punching the kid against the wall. Faye observed all this very seriously. Tomorrow's star wasn't supposed to be just good, had to be extraordinary. And he told the instructors to be aware, since the future of the country could not become statistical in the hospital. But at that time he began to notice some disasters. 17-year-old Khan King of Dongzhou Province. Domain Lightning Elemental 2, Diavoran, years old, from Xingjiao, level 2 mentalist. Thingzi, years old, Sadolin, your gift was from Berlin. Sensitive skin. Faye was very pleased, thinking those 3 had everything to make a difference. For him, the final result, I would definitely leave there, until a fire elemental control candidate ended up getting a lot of your attention. It was strange that he was not highlighted. Hyung Kunlin explained that Zoli had awakened his gift recently, and the data had not yet been recorded. But everyone pulled out that Ling was hiding the game to get everyone by surprise. And he still stared at the Shui Queen, remembering their bet. He even really enjoyed that tense atmosphere between them. But out of nowhere he ends up getting scared. A battle track advances too fast. And it was fast to the point of monster indicators simply disappear. They wanted to know who the hell that crazy guy was, and immediately pulls the cameras. Shui Queen just obeyed. And in 3 minutes of proof, that candidate had already cleaned everything. And it was just already in the final boss. And the most surprising thing is that he was alone. At a speed. Absurd. Faye asked for replay and Shrek almost some time. Since it was Luxembourg, the scene then ends up going back for 3 minutes. In the past, a huge wild boar was running on top of Luxembourg. That didn't even. But only one punch has ever broken the horn of that animal, and the Luxembourg thought he too weak monster. That even boredom in him. But another door ends up opening, and another wild boar ends up appearing. He took the horn from the first and threw at the second, crushing the bud with a brute impact. He tested the skills, as if on a level above. Shu Kong, almost omniscient, and a demonic cat, tried to attack, but it was counterattacked, and everything was flowing perfectly. It was very strange. The advance of Luxem was too fast for anyone, student who was there, and he was already on the last stage of the trek, and still looked like an ordinary guy. Only every punch he threw had an impact. Completely insane. The monsters fell at the base of the punch and celebrated. Information about him, allowed. Shuiken said that Luchin had come from the Dom tribe. Nang and was years old. Force-type martial artist rating 3. If you hear this, languages almost went bad. The problem of everything is that no one saw special skill in that boy, but was inattentive, realized that Luchin dominated at least 4 martial arts and an improved internship. Steps in techniques had already entered the internal discernment, and that was exactly why your combat. It was so out of the corner. Everyone ended up getting lost, and it has been a long time since Fei didn't see a talent at that level, but at the same time he was excited. He was very surprised, since that full lob faced 3 monsters at the same time. In an absurd perception, and your complete martial arts ended up in action. He catches one of the monsters and throws it to the ground like a child's toy. And the beast ends up realizing it right away, that it was no longer inner discernment. It was actually the deep control. Xiao Jun finally understood the talk of 99% confidence. That selection was already decided, and Ling Yi is starting to feel really bad now. Xiao Zhou still provokes, asking why that ugly bug was staring at him, and Luxem finishes the last monster in that area, using the maximum limit of complete martial arts. But he felt a very heady presence ahead here. This was the final boss, and that's what he was feeling, and the Firefly ended up getting serious, since now he needed to go with everything he had. He wanted everyone to shiver, seeing what was about to happen in that battle.